Welcome to the channel. We're so glad you're here. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to click like and subscribe to stay updated with our latest content. Your support helps us create more awesome videos for you. Let us know what you think in the comments below. Enjoy the video. The Mists of Moorhaven. Rory McIntyre, a seasoned motorcyclist, prided himself on his calm demeanor and his ability to handle any situation the road threw at him. He'd ridden through torrential downpours, navigated treacherous mountain passes, and endured scorching desert heat, all without losing his cool. He enjoyed the solitude of the open road, the feeling of freedom, the hum of his engine a constant companion. But one night, on a remote stretch of road shrouded in an unnatural fog, his composure would be tested like never before. He was riding through Moorhaven, a sparsely populated region known for its rolling hills, ancient forests, and persistent mists. It was late, well past midnight, and the road was deserted. Rory had been riding for hours, heading towards a small coastal town where he planned to spend the night. The temperature began to drop noticeably. A chill seeped into his bones, despite his layers of protective gear. He hadn't seen another vehicle for miles, and the silence was unnerving, broken only by the thrum of his engine and the occasional hoot of an owl. Then, he saw it, a wall of fog, dense and impenetrable, stretching across the road ahead. It wasn't a typical fog. It was thicker, more opaque, as if a solid barrier had been erected across his path. He slowed down, his instincts on high alert. He switched his headlight to high beam, but the light simply bounced back, reflecting off the dense, swirling mist. Visibility dropped to near zero. He hesitated. He could turn back, try to find another route. But he was low on fuel, and the nearest town was miles behind him. He decided to press on cautiously. He entered the fog, and the world around him dissolved into a gray, swirling void. He could barely see a few feet in front of him. The air was thick and damp, clinging to his visor, his clothes, his skin. His engine started to sputter. He felt a jolt of alarm. His bike, a trusty Triumph Bonneville, was meticulously maintained. He'd never had engine trouble before. He pulled over to the side of the road, as best he could judge it, and killed the engine. The silence that descended was absolute, terrifying. He was enveloped in a cocoon of fog, cut off from the world. He tried to restart the engine, coughed, sputtered, and died. He tried again. Nothing. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel shoulder. He checked the fuel line, the spark plugs, the battery connections. Everything seemed to be in order. He heard a sound, a faint, rustling sound, like someone walking through dry leaves. He turned, peering into the fog, his heart pounding. He saw nothing. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing strangely in the dense mist. "Is anyone there?" Silence. He heard the sound again, closer this time. It wasn't leaves. It was more like footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps, approaching him through the fog. He felt a surge of fear. He grabbed a wrench from his toolkit, his hand trembling. He held it up defensively, his eyes scanning the swirling gray void. He heard a whisper, a faint, sibilant whisper that seemed to come from all around him. He couldn't make out the words, but it sounded mocking. He felt a cold dread grip him. This wasn't a normal fog. This was something else, something unnatural. He decided to try to push his bike, to walk it out of the fog. He didn't know where he was going, but he had to move, had to escape the oppressive silence, the unseen presence that seemed to be closing in on him. He started walking, pushing his heavy bike along the side of the road. The fog was so thick he could barely see his own feet. He kept his head down, focused on the task at hand, trying to ignore the whispers, the rustling sounds, the growing sense of dread. He walked for what felt like hours, his muscles aching, his lungs burning. The fog showed no signs of thinning. He was lost, disoriented, trapped in a gray, swirling labyrinth. He saw a faint light ahead, a glimmer, a flicker in the distance. He felt a surge of hope. Maybe it was a house, a farm, a sign of civilization. He pushed on, his pace quickening, his eyes fixed on the light. As he got closer, the light seemed to recede. It was always just out of reach, flickering and fading, like a will-o'-the-wisp. He heard the whispers again, louder now, closer. They seemed to be circling him, taunting him, mocking his efforts. He could almost make out words, fragments of sentences, spoken in a language he didn't understand. He felt a presence, a cold, malevolent presence, just behind him. He turned quickly, swinging the wrench, but there was nothing there. Only the fog, the silence, and the growing sense of terror. He was starting to lose it. He was starting to believe that he would never escape, that he would wander in this fog forever, haunted by the whispers, by the unseen presence, by the endless gray void. He knew this was more than just fog. He knew it was a test. He had to pass somehow. Rory stumbled onward, his legs heavy, his lungs burning. He was soaked through, the damp fog clinging to him like a shroud. He had lost all sense of time, all sense of direction. The faint light he had seen earlier had vanished, leaving him in complete darkness. He was about to give up, to collapse on the side of the road and surrender to the despair that was threatening to engulf him, when he heard a new sound. A low, rhythmic throbbing, like a distant drumbeat. He paused, listening. The sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't the whispers, it wasn't the rustling. It was something different. It was rhythmic, almost hypnotic. He felt a strange compulsion to follow the sound, to find its source. He started walking again, pushing his bike along, his steps guided by the throbbing rhythm. The fog began to thin, slightly. He could see a few feet further ahead now. He saw the outline of trees, tall and gaunt, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The throbbing grew louder, and he saw a faint glow ahead, a warm, orange light that pulsed in time with the rhythm. He pushed on, his heart pounding, his senses on high alert. He emerged from the fog into a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a large, ancient oak tree, its trunk wider than his bike was long. The orange light emanated from the base of the tree, and the throbbing sound seemed to come from within the tree itself. He approached the tree cautiously, his eyes wide with disbelief. He saw that there was a small opening at the base of the trunk, a hollowed-out space that glowed with an eerie, internal light. He peered inside. He saw nothing, just darkness. But the throbbing continued, and the orange light pulsed, and he felt a strange sense of peace. The whispers were gone. The rustling had stopped. The fog had receded. He was alone in the clearing with the ancient oak tree. He didn't understand what was happening, but he felt drawn to the tree, to the opening, to the darkness within. He felt a compulsion to enter, to step inside, to become one with the throbbing rhythm. He hesitated. A part of him, the rational, logical part, screamed at him to turn back, to run, to escape. But another part, a deeper, more primal part, urged him forward. He made his decision. He leaned his bike against the tree, took a deep breath, and stepped into the darkness. The moment he crossed the threshold, the throbbing stopped. The orange light vanished. He was enveloped in absolute silence, in absolute darkness. He felt a sense of release, of letting go, of surrendering to something larger than himself. He felt his body dissolve, his consciousness fade. He was no longer Rory McIntyre, the motorcyclist, the man of logic and reason. He was something else, something part of the tree, part of the clearing, part of the fog. He was gone. The clearing remained silent and still. The ancient oak tree stood guard, its branches reaching out to the sky. The fog swirled around it, a silent, watchful presence. And the road remained, stretching out into the darkness, waiting for its next traveler. The mists of Moorhaven would continue their dance. The whispers waited, in the fog, for another to stray. The tree stood, always, the unseen sweeper of Eldridge House. Bernard Croft was the caretaker of Eldridge House, a sprawling, century-old apartment building with a reputation for being peculiar. He wasn't a superstitious man, but he'd learned to accept the building's quirks. The flickering lights, the unexplained drafts, the occasional creaks and groans that echoed through the empty corridors. He was a practical man, focused on maintenance schedules, tenant complaints, and the endless battle against entropy that came with managing an aging structure. One morning, however, something occurred that challenged Bernard's pragmatic worldview. He was up early, as usual, making his rounds, checking for any overnight issues. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale, ethereal light across the courtyard, a paved area enclosed by the building's fir wings. He was standing near the main entrance, sipping his lukewarm coffee, when he saw him. A man, dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned janitor's uniform, was sweeping the courtyard. He was using a wide push broom, moving with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Bernard frowned. He didn't recognize the man. He knew all the building staff, and there was no one scheduled to clean the courtyard that early. He watched the man for a moment, his curiosity piqued. And then he noticed it. The man had no shadow. The rising sun was casting long, distinct shadows of the trees, the benches, the potted plants. But the man, who was standing in direct sunlight, had no shadow whatsoever. He was a solid, three-dimensional figure, moving, breathing, sweeping, but he cast no shadow on the ground. Bernard felt a chill run down his spine. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, thinking he must be seeing things. But the man was still there, still sweeping, still shadowless. He took a step forward, his boots crunching on the gravel path. "Hey!" he called out, his voice louder than he intended. "You! Who are you?" The man didn't respond. He didn't even look up. He just kept sweeping, his movements slow and methodical. Bernard approached him cautiously, his heart pounding. He could hear the rhythmic swish of the broom, the sound oddly amplified in the quiet morning air. "Excuse me," Bernard said, his voice trembling slightly. "Can I help you? Are you with the cleaning service?" The man stopped sweeping. He slowly turned his head and looked at Bernard. His eyes were vacant. They were pale, almost colorless, and they seemed to lack pupils, irises, any sign of life. They were like two empty sockets, staring blankly at him. Bernard felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. He wanted to run, to scream, but he couldn't. He was frozen in place, transfixed by the man's unsettling gaze. The man turned back to his sweeping, resuming his slow, rhythmic movements. He ignored Bernard completely, as if he were invisible. Bernard stood there for a moment, his mind reeling. He didn't know what to do, what to say. He felt like he was losing his grip on reality. He finally managed to break free from his paralysis. He turned and walked quickly back towards the building entrance, his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't look back. He went to his office, a small, cluttered room filled with files, tools, and maintenance logs. He sat down at his desk, his hands shaking. He tried to calm himself, to think rationally. He checked the building's records, the staff schedules, the contact information for the cleaning service. There was no one scheduled to be there. There was no record of anyone matching the man's description. He called the cleaning service, but they confirmed that they had no employees on site that morning. They also confirmed that they didn't use that type of uniform, nor did they have a worker who matched Bernard's physical description. Bernard felt a growing sense of dread. He knew what he had seen. He had seen a man sweeping the courtyard with no shadow, and he had seen those eyes, those vacant, lifeless eyes. He decided to investigate further. He spent the rest of the day searching the building, checking every room, every corridor, every closet. He found nothing. He asked the tenants if they had seen anything unusual, if they had noticed a strange man in the courtyard. They all shook their heads, looking at him with a mixture of concern and amusement. He started to doubt himself. Was he hallucinating? Was he losing his mind? But he couldn't shake the image of the shadowless man, the unsettling feeling of his gaze. He decided to wait. He would return to the courtyard the next morning at the same time and see if the man reappeared. He spent a restless night, tossing and turning, haunted by fragmented images of empty eyes and sweeping brooms. He woke up before dawn, his body tense, his mind racing. He went to the courtyard, his heart pounding, his hands clammy. The sky was still dark, but the first hint of dawn was beginning to paint the eastern horizon. And there he was, the man, sweeping, shadowless. Bernard felt a surge of fear, but also a strange sense of determination. He had to confront him, had to find out who he was, what he was doing there. He approached him slowly, cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the quiet morning air. He stopped a few feet away, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling. "What are you doing here?" The man stopped sweeping. He slowly turned his head and looked at Bernard. His eyes were just as vacant, just as unsettling as before. And then he spoke. His voice was a low, raspy whisper, barely audible above the sound of the wind. "I am the keeper," he said. "I am the cleaner. I am forever." Bernard felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't understand what the man meant, but the words, the tone, the delivery sent a wave of terror through him. The man turned back to his sweeping, resuming his slow, rhythmic movements. He ignored Bernard completely, as if he were no longer there. Bernard stood there, frozen, his mind reeling. He didn't know what to do, what to say. He felt like he had stumbled into a nightmare, a world beyond his comprehension. He finally managed to break free from his paralysis. He turned and fled, running back into the building, his heart pounding, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He locked himself in his office, his body shaking uncontrollably. He sat there, staring at the door, expecting it to burst open at any moment. But nothing happened. The building remained silent, except for the usual creaks and groans. Bernard knew he couldn't stay there. He couldn't face the shadowless man again. He couldn't live with the unsettling mystery, the constant fear. He packed a small bag, gathered his essential belongings, and left Eldridge House forever. He didn't tell anyone where he was going or why. He just vanished. The building remained, the secrets intact, and the shadowless man continued to sweep the courtyard every morning at dawn, a silent, eternal presence, a keeper of something unknown, the intrusive echo of apartment 4B. Adrian Miller, a software developer seeking respite from the relentless noise of the city, had chosen apartment 4B in the quiet, unassuming building on Elm Street for its promise of tranquility. The advertisement had described it as a peaceful haven, and during his initial visit, Adrian had been struck by the almost unnatural stillness of the place. The walls were thick, the windows were double-paned, and the neighbors seemed to be non-existent. It was perfect. He moved in with minimal fuss. His belongings were few: a comfortable armchair, a narrow bed, a desk for his computer, and a collection of books that served as his primary form of entertainment. He valued simplicity, quiet, and solitude. The first few days were exactly as he'd hoped. He worked from home, coding in blissful silence. The only sounds the gentle hum of his computer and the occasional tapping of his keyboard. He slept soundly, undisturbed by the noises that had plagued him in his previous, more urban dwellings. But then, he started to notice something peculiar. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. He'd be talking to himself, muttering reminders or working through a coding problem aloud, and he'd hear a faint echo. Not a normal echo, the kind you'd expect in a room with hard surfaces. This was different. It was delayed, slightly distorted, and unsettlingly familiar. Sounded like his own voice, but altered, as if someone were mimicking him, but with a slight delay and a subtle change in tone. He initially dismissed it as his imagination, a product of his solitary existence, his mind playing tricks on him. He was, after all, spending most of his time alone in silence. But the echo persisted. It grew more frequent, more distinct. Started to respond, not just repeat. He'd say, "Need to finish this code by Friday," and the echo would whisper back, "Friday finish," but with a strange, drawn-out intonation. He'd mutter, "Time for coffee," and the echo would respond, "Coffee time," with a chilling, almost mocking quality. He started to feel uneasy, a prickle of anxiety that disturbed his carefully cultivated calm. He checked the vents, the walls, the windows. He looked for any possible source of the sound, any rational explanation. He found nothing. He tried to ignore it, to focus on his work, to drown it out with music or podcasts. But the echo always found a way to penetrate his defenses, to intrude upon his thoughts. One evening, he was showering, the water rushing over him, the steam filling the small bathroom. He was talking to himself as usual, going over his schedule for the next day. Meeting at 10, call with the client at 2, finish the report by 5. And then he heard it, the echo. But this time it wasn't repeating his words. It was saying something different. Trapped. It whispered, a chilling, guttural sound that seemed to come from the drain. Adrian froze, his heart pounding. He turned off the water, the silence descending abruptly. He listened, his breath catching in his throat. Nothing. He told himself it was just the pipes, the water, his imagination, but he couldn't shake the feeling of dread, the sense of being watched, of being invaded. He started to avoid speaking aloud. He communicated with himself through written notes, through silent gestures. He tried to maintain a state of absolute quiet, hoping to starve the echo, to silence it. But it didn't work. The echo found other ways to manifest. He'd hear it in the creaking of the floorboards, in the rustling of the curtains, in the hum of the refrigerator. It was always there, lurking in the background, a constant, unsettling reminder of its presence. One night, he was lying in bed, trying to sleep. The apartment was dark, silent. He was staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. And then he heard it, his own voice whispering his name. Adrian, it whispered, a soft, sibilant sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves. He sat up in bed, his heart hammering against his ribs. He turned on the bedside lamp, his hand trembling. The room was empty, but the whispering continued. Adrian trapped here. He felt a surge of panic. He had to get out. He had to escape the apartment, the echo, the unsettling presence that seemed to be closing in on him. He scrambled out of bed, grabbed his keys, and ran out of the apartment, not bothering to lock the door. He ran down the stairs, out of the building, into the street. He stood there, gasping for breath, his body shaking. He looked back at the building, at his apartment window, expecting to see something, anything, that could explain what was happening. But the window was dark, silent, empty. He didn't go back. He couldn't. He stayed at a friend's house that night, and the next day, he arranged to move out of the apartment, breaking his lease, forfeiting his security deposit. He didn't care. He just had to get away. He never found out what the echo was, where it came from, or what it wanted. He never spoke to the landlord, never reported the strange occurrences. He just left, but he never forgot it. He never forgot the feeling of being watched, of being haunted by his own voice, of being trapped in a silent, unsettling nightmare. And he never lived alone again. The echo, he feared, might find him once more, might whisper his name in the darkness, might remind him that he was never truly alone. The forbidden wing of Blackwood Sanatorium. Dr. Elias Thorne, a newly appointed archivist at the long-abandoned Blackwood Sanatorium, was a man of meticulous order and historical curiosity. He'd been tasked with cataloging the remaining records of the institution, a daunting project considering the sanatorium's sprawling size and its troubled past. Blackwood had a reputation, whispered among the locals, of being a place of suffering, of unexplained deaths, of patients who vanished without a trace. Elias, a staunch rationalist, dismissed these stories as local legends. He spent his days immersed in the dusty, musty archives, poring over patient files, medical records, and administrative documents. He found the work fascinating, a glimpse into a bygone era of medical practice, a window into the lives of those who had been confined within Blackwood's walls. One evening, while working late, Sorting through a box of unlabeled files, he discovered a set of blueprints. They were old, yellowed, and brittle, but the lines were still clear, depicting the layout of the sanatorium. As he examined the blueprints, he noticed something odd. A section of the building, a wing on the third floor, that he hadn't seen before. It was labeled simply as Ward X. He compared the blueprints to the official floor plans he'd been given. Ward X wasn't there. It was as if it had been deliberately omitted, erased from the record. His curiosity piqued. He decided to investigate. He grabbed his flashlight, a heavy-duty mag light that he always carried with him, and headed towards the third floor. The third floor was even more dilapidated than the rest of the sanatorium. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. The paint was peeling from the walls, the floorboards creaked under his weight, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional scuttling of unseen creatures. He followed the blueprints, navigating the maze of corridors, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. He reached the area where Ward X should have been, but he found only a blank wall. He frowned. He checked the blueprints again. He was in the right place. There should have been a corridor, a door, something, but there was nothing. He ran his hand along the wall, feeling the cold, rough surface. He tapped on it, listening for any hollowness, any indication of a hidden passage. He heard nothing. The wall seemed solid, unbroken. He was about to give up, to dismiss it as an error in the blueprints, when he noticed something, a faint outline, barely visible in the dim light. It was the shape of a door, a rectangular frame that had been plastered over, painted over, concealed. He felt a surge of excitement. He had found it. Ward X, the forbidden wing. He pulled out a small pocket knife and started scraping at the plaster, carefully, meticulously, revealing the edges of the hidden door. It was slow, painstaking work, but he persisted, driven by a growing sense of anticipation. After what felt like hours, he had cleared enough of the plaster to reveal the door frame. It was made of heavy, dark wood, and it was locked. He tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. He examined the lock. It was old, rusty, but surprisingly sturdy. He knew he shouldn't force it, that he should probably report his findings to the authorities, but his curiosity, his desire to uncover the secrets of Ward X, overwhelmed his caution. He took a deep breath and kicked the door, hard, near the handle. The wood splintered, but the door held. He kicked again and again and again, putting all his weight behind each blow. Finally, with a loud crack, the door gave way. It swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow corridor. Elias felt a chill run down his spine. He hesitated for a moment, his heart pounding, his mind racing. He knew he was crossing a line, that he was venturing into forbidden territory, but he couldn't turn back. He had to know what was inside. He switched on his flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness, and stepped into the forbidden wing of Blackwood Sanatorium. He had no idea that it was a point of no return. The air in Ward X was colder, heavier, and carried a faint, metallic scent that made Elias's stomach churn. The corridor was narrow and claustrophobic, the walls lined with peeling paint and damp patches. He could hear the faint dripping of water, the scuttling of unseen creatures, and a low, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. He proceeded cautiously, his flashlight beam illuminating the way. He passed several doors, each with a small, barred window. He peered inside, his heart pounding. The rooms were small, bare, and desolate. They contained only a single, narrow bed frame, a rusted metal chair, and a small, stained sink. Some of the rooms had restraints attached to the beds, thick leather straps that spoke of confinement and suffering. He felt a growing sense of unease, a profound sadness that settled over him like a shroud. This was a place of pain, of despair, of forgotten souls. He reached the end of the corridor and found another door, larger than the others, with a heavy metal plate bolted to it. The plate had no number, no label, just a single word etched into the metal. Silence. He hesitated. He knew instinctively that this was the heart of Ward X, the place where the darkest secrets were kept. He felt a strong urge to turn back, to leave this place and never return. But his curiosity, his obsession with uncovering the truth, was too strong. He reached for the handle, his hand trembling. The handle was cold, surprisingly cold, as if it were made of ice. He turned it, and the door creaked open, revealing a large, circular room. The room was dimly lit by a single, flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with jars containing specimens. Elias felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He recognized the shapes in the jars, the pale, distorted forms floating in a murky fluid. They were human organs, brains, hearts, lungs, eyes, all preserved, all labeled with small handwritten tags. He stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. He wanted to scream, to run, but he couldn't. He was frozen in place, transfixed by the horrific display. He heard a sound, a faint, whispering sound, coming from the center of the room. He turned his head, slowly, reluctantly, and saw it. In the center of the room, on a raised platform, stood a large metal operating table. And on the table, strapped down with thick leather restraints, was a figure. A human figure, emaciated, pale, its skin stretched taut over its bones. Its head was shaved, and its eyes were gone. Empty sockets stared up at the ceiling, but it was alive. Elias could see the faint rise and fall of its chest, the subtle twitching of its fingers. He could hear its ragged breathing, a rasping, gurgling sound that filled the room. He felt a surge of terror, unlike anything he had ever experienced. He wanted to run, to escape, but his legs wouldn't move. He was trapped, paralyzed by fear. The figure on the table began to stir. It thrashed against the restraints, its body convulsing, its empty eye sockets widening in a silent scream. The whispering grew louder, filling the room, surrounding Elias, penetrating his very being. He couldn't make out the words, but he could feel the intent behind them. It was a cold, malevolent intent, a hunger, a thirst, a desire to consume. He realized, with a chilling certainty, that he had stumbled upon something truly evil, something that should have remained hidden, forgotten. He had unleashed something that he couldn't control, something that would now haunt him forever. He finally managed to break free from his paralysis. He turned and fled, running blindly through the corridor, through the decaying rooms, through the darkness. He burst through the hidden door, back into the relative safety of the main sanatorium. He didn't stop running until he reached his office, until he had locked the door behind him, until he was surrounded by the familiar, comforting clutter of his files and books. He collapsed into his chair, his body shaking, his mind reeling. He tried to tell himself it was a hallucination, a nightmare, a product of his overactive imagination. But he knew it wasn't. He had seen it. He had felt it. He had heard it. The silent scream of Ward X. He had found his truth, and he was not sure he could live with it. The sanatorium stood, silent, and waiting, crimson stain. Amelia Redfield, a curator at a small regional museum, had a passion for objects with a past. She loved the stories embedded within antique furniture, the whispers of lives lived, the echoes of bygone eras. So when a local estate sale advertised a collection of antique furnishings, she was immediately intrigued. The sale was held in a grand, if somewhat dilapidated, Victorian house. Amelia wandered through the rooms, examining the furniture, the paintings, the various knickknacks. Most of the items were unremarkable, the usual assortment of faded tapestries, chipped china, and dusty books. But in a corner of the drawing room, partially obscured by a moth-eaten velvet curtain, she found it. An armchair. It wasn't particularly grand or ornate. It was a simple, sturdy armchair, upholstered in a deep crimson fabric. The wood was dark and polished, probably mahogany, and the arms were worn smooth from years of use. There was something about it, though, that drew her in, a sense of age, of history, of presence. She examined it closely, The fabric was faded and worn in places, with a few small tears and frayed edges. The springs creaked slightly when she pressed on the cushion. It was clearly old, but it was also surprisingly comfortable. She decided to buy it. It was reasonably priced, and she thought it would look perfect in her own living room, a touch of vintage charm amidst her more modern furnishings. She arranged for the armchair to be delivered to her apartment the next day. She cleared a space for it near her fireplace, imagining herself curled up in it with a good book. When the armchair arrived, she carefully inspected it again. She noticed a few details she'd missed at the estate sale. The wood was more intricately carved than she'd realized, with subtle floral patterns along the arms and legs, and the crimson fabric had a faint, almost imperceptible pattern woven into it, a series of swirling lines that seemed to shift and change in the light. She ran her hand over the fabric, feeling the texture, the slight roughness of the worn areas. She felt a chill run down her spine. It wasn't a cold chill exactly, but more like a tingling sensation, a sense of unease. She dismissed it as her imagination. She was, after all, surrounded by old objects all the time. It was natural to feel a certain reverence for them. She placed the armchair in its designated spot, and it fit perfectly. It looked as if it had always belonged there. She sat in it, testing it out. It was surprisingly comfortable, the cushion molding to her shape, the arms perfectly positioned for resting her elbows. She felt a warmth spread through her, a sense of relaxation, of contentment. She closed her eyes and leaned back, enjoying the feeling of sinking into the soft fabric. And then she felt it, a cold spot on the back of her neck. It was as if a cold draft were blowing on her, a localized chill that seemed to emanate from the chair itself. She opened her eyes and looked around. The windows were closed. There were no vents nearby. There was no logical explanation for the cold spot. She got up and examined the chair again. She ran her hand over the back, feeling for any tears or gaps in the fabric. She found nothing. She sat down again, trying to ignore the cold spot. She tried to read, but she couldn't concentrate. The feeling of unease persisted, growing stronger with each passing minute. She started to feel watched, as if someone were standing behind her, staring at her. She turned around quickly, her heart pounding. But there was no one there, only the empty room, the silent furniture, and the crimson armchair. She got up and paced around the room, trying to shake off the feeling. She told herself she was being ridiculous, that it was just an old chair, that her imagination was running wild. But she couldn't shake the feeling of unease, the sense of being watched, the persistent cold spot on the back of her neck. She decided to go to bed, hoping that sleep would bring some relief. She changed into her pajamas, brushed her teeth, and climbed into bed. She lay there, in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the city outside. She tried to clear her mind, to focus on her breathing, to relax. But she couldn't. She kept thinking about the armchair, about the cold spot, about the feeling of being watched. She heard a sound, a faint creaking sound, coming from the living room. She froze, her heart pounding. She listened intently. The creaking continued, a slow, rhythmic sound, like someone shifting their weight in the armchair. She got out of bed, her legs trembling. She grabbed a small flashlight from her bedside table and crept towards the living room door. She paused, listening. The creaking had stopped. The apartment was silent. She took a deep breath and opened the door. The living room was dimly lit by the streetlights outside. She could see the outline of the armchair, its crimson fabric a dark, almost black, shape in the shadows. She switched on her flashlight and pointed it at the chair. It was empty, but the cushion was indented, as if someone had been sitting there recently. Amelia felt a wave of terror wash over her. She backed away from the chair, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew with a chilling certainty that she was not alone. Something was in the armchair, something unseen, something cold, and it was watching her. She could practically feel the springs adjusting as it released the seat. Amelia backed away from the armchair, her flashlight beam shaking in her trembling hand. The indentation on the cushion slowly faded, the fabric smoothing out as if an invisible weight had been lifted. She wanted to run, to flee the apartment, but her legs felt like lead. She was trapped, paralyzed by fear. She stood there, staring at the armchair, her mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. She heard a faint whisper, a soft, sibilant sound that seemed to come from the chair itself. She couldn't make out any words, but it sounded mournful, almost pleading. She took a step forward, hesitantly, her curiosity overcoming her fear. She leaned closer to the chair, her flashlight beam illuminating the crimson fabric, the worn armrests, the carved legs. She saw something she hadn't noticed before, a small, dark stain on the cushion, near the back. It was almost the same color as the fabric, but it was different. It was darker, more concentrated. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched the stain. It was sticky, slightly tacky to the touch, and it smelled metallic. She recoiled, her stomach churning. She knew instinctively what the stain was. Blood, old dried blood. She felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She stumbled back, away from the chair, away from the stain, away from the unseen presence that seemed to emanate from it. She ran to the bathroom, turned on the faucet, and scrubbed her hand furiously, trying to wash away the feel of the stain, the smell of the blood. But it wouldn't go away. It lingered, a phantom sensation, a chilling reminder of the darkness that resided within the armchair. She spent the rest of the night huddled in her bedroom, the lights on, the door locked. She didn't sleep. She sat on the bed, staring at the door, listening for any sound, any sign of the unseen presence. As dawn approached, she heard the creaking again, the slow, rhythmic sound of someone shifting their weight in the armchair. She held her breath, her heart pounding. The creaking continued for several minutes, then stopped. She knew she couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. She had to get rid of the armchair, to sever the connection to whatever dark force it contained. She waited until the sun was fully up, until the streets outside were filled with the sounds of morning activity. Then, she cautiously opened her bedroom door and peered into the living room. The armchair was there, bathed in the morning light. It looked ordinary, just an old, worn armchair. But Amelia knew better. She approached it slowly, her body tense, her senses on high alert. She reached out and touched the fabric, the crimson stain. It was still there, still sticky, still smelling faintly of metal. She grabbed the chair, her hands shaking, and started to drag it towards the door. It was heavier than she expected, as if something were resisting her efforts. She struggled, pulling and pushing, her muscles straining. She finally managed to get the armchair out of the apartment and into the hallway. She dragged it down the stairs, bumping and scraping against the walls, ignoring the stares of her neighbors. She got it outside onto the sidewalk and left it there in the bright sunlight. She didn't care if someone stole it, if it was damaged, if it disappeared. She just wanted it gone. She went back inside, locked her apartment door, and collapsed onto her couch, exhausted and terrified. She knew she couldn't stay there. She had to find a new place to live, a place where she could feel safe, a place where she wouldn't be haunted by the memory of the crimson armchair. She started packing her belongings, her hands still shaking, her mind still racing. She would leave everything behind, start over, try to forget. But she knew deep down that she would never truly be free. The image of the armchair, the cold spot, the whispering sound, the metallic scent of the stain would forever haunt her. The unseen presence, whatever it was, would remain, a chilling reminder of the darkness that lurked within the seemingly ordinary objects of the world. And the crimson stain would forever mark the place where her sense of security had been shattered. She knew it wasn't over. Shifting sands, shifting fates. The open road, a ribbon of asphalt unwinding across the vast American landscape, had always beckoned to Noah with the promise of freedom, of escape, of self-discovery. He never imagined it could become a confining cage, a mobile prison, with every mile bringing him closer to an unknown, malevolent force that seemed determined to ensnare him. Noah had long dreamt of embarking on a cross-country road trip, the quintessential American adventure. The idea of driving from coast to coast, witnessing the dramatic shifts in scenery, from bustling metropolises to rolling farmlands to majestic mountain ranges, had captivated his imagination since he was a child. So, when he finally accumulated sufficient savings and secured a generous block of vacation time, he didn't hesitate. He meticulously packed his trusty Honda Civic, crafted a flexible, open-ended itinerary, and set off from his home in Boston, heading west, his heart filled with a mixture of excitement and anticipation. The first few days were everything he had envisioned, and more. He traversed quaint New England towns, their historic charm palpable. He stopped at roadside diners, indulging in generous slices of homemade pie and engaging in conversations with locals. He marveled at the gradual, yet dramatic transformation of the landscape as he crossed into the Midwest. The land opened up, vast and expansive, and Noah felt a sense of liberation he had never before experienced. It was in a small, unassuming town in Nebraska, approximately a week into his journey, that the tenor of his adventure shifted, subtly at first, then with increasing, alarming speed. Noah had stopped for gas at a somewhat run-down station on the outskirts of town. As he was filling his tank, he noticed a group of men lounging near a battered, rust-covered pickup truck, observing him with an intensity that made him distinctly uncomfortable. Something about their gaze, their posture, their collective demeanor sent a shiver of unease down his spine. But he dismissed it, attributing it to the natural curiosity of small-town residents towards an out-of-state visitor. He went inside the station to pay for his gas and purchase some snacks for the road. When he emerged, the men were gone. But as he walked back to his car, he could have sworn he saw their truck pulling out of the station, heading in the same direction he was. Noah shook off his growing sense of paranoia and resumed his journey, cranking up the radio and singing along to his favorite tunes in an attempt to distract himself from the unsettling encounter. It wasn't until about an hour later that he noticed the truck again. It was far behind him, a distant speck in his rearview mirror, but he recognized the distinctive rust pattern on its hood, the dented bumper. His heart rate increased slightly, a knot of anxiety forming in his stomach. But he rationalized it, telling himself it was merely a coincidence. After all, there was only one major highway traversing this particular stretch of the state. It made sense that they would be traveling in the same direction. However, as the miles relentlessly ticked by, the truck remained a constant, unwavering presence in his rearview mirror. Sometimes it would disappear for extended periods, only to reappear later, always maintaining a safe distance, but never quite allowing him to escape its watchful presence. By the time the sun began to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the vast, open plains, Noah was in a state of escalating panic. He considered pulling over in the next town, perhaps seeking assistance from the local police. But a nagging voice in his head, a growing sense of dread, warned him that stopping could be even more dangerous. What if these men were locals? What if they had connections within the community? In his increasingly agitated state, every small town seemed like a potential trap, a potential dead end. So, Noah kept driving, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes constantly flicking to his rearview mirror. The vast, open landscape, which had seemed so liberating, so exhilarating just hours before, now felt oppressive, menacing. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to escape the relentless scrutiny of his pursuers. As night descended, cloaking the world in darkness, Noah made a snap decision. At the next junction, instead of continuing west, as he had originally planned, he abruptly turned south. It was a desperate gamble, a maneuver he hoped might throw off whoever was following him. For a blissful, fleeting half-hour, he saw no sign of the truck. He began to relax, to breathe a little easier, thinking perhaps he had imagined the whole thing, that his anxiety had gotten the better of him. Then, at the crest of a hill, he saw them, headlights in the distance, approaching rapidly. His blood ran cold. Somehow, impossibly, they had found him again. Noah pressed down hard on the accelerator, pushing his aging Civic to its limits. The speedometer needle crept past 80, then 90, but the headlights in his rearview mirror continued to gain ground. His car wasn't designed for this kind of speed, and every bump, every irregularity in the road surface felt like it might send him careening off into the darkness. Suddenly, a new set of headlights appeared ahead of him, illuminating the road with blinding intensity. Another truck, similar in appearance to the one pursuing him, was barreling towards him, head-on. Noah realized, with a surge of pure, unadulterated terror, that they were attempting to box him in, to force him to stop. With mere seconds to react, with no time for considered thought, Noah did the only thing he could think of. He yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, sending his car careening off the paved road and onto a narrow, barely visible dirt track he hadn't even noticed in the darkness. The car bounced violently, the suspension protesting loudly, and for a terrifying moment, Noah feared he would lose control completely. But somehow, miraculously, he managed to keep the vehicle upright, plunging deeper and deeper into the unknown, uncharted terrain. He killed his headlights, relying solely on the faint, ethereal glow of the moon to guide him, a desperate gamble to evade his pursuers. Behind him, he could hear the roar of engines as the trucks attempted to follow, but their larger, less maneuverable vehicles struggled on the rough, uneven ground. Slowly, gradually, the sounds of pursuit began to fade. Noah drove for what felt like an eternity, though in reality, it was probably only a matter of minutes. Every bump, every jolt, sent a fresh spike of fear through him, the constant threat of crashing, of being stranded, looming large in his mind. But somehow, against all odds, he kept going. Finally, when he could no longer hear any sign of his pursuers, when the only sound was the frantic beating of his own heart and the chirping of crickets, he allowed himself to slow down. He was completely, utterly lost, surrounded by what appeared to be farmland, with no idea which direction would lead him back to civilization, back to safety. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely grip the wheel, and his heart was pounding so furiously he was certain it would burst from his chest. He pulled to a stop in the shadow of what looked like an abandoned barn, killed the engine, and sat there, in the oppressive silence of the night, straining his ears for any sound of approaching vehicles. But there was nothing, only the sounds of the rural night, the chirping of crickets, the distant mooing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the tall grass. As the adrenaline that had fueled his desperate flight began to subside, the full weight of his predicament crashed down on Noah. He was alone, stranded in the middle of nowhere, being hunted by unknown assailants for reasons he couldn't begin to fathom. His mind raced, a chaotic whirlwind of questions and fears. Who were these people? What did they want from him? How had they managed to follow him for so long, across such vast distances, without him even noticing? Had he unknowingly witnessed something he shouldn't have at that first gas station? Had he somehow offended them? He checked his phone, hoping against hope for a signal, a connection to the outside world, but there was nothing. He was truly, utterly alone, cut off from any assistance. As the first pale light of dawn began to creep across the sky, painting the horizon in shades of gray and pink, Noah made a decision. He couldn't remain where he was, a sitting duck, and he couldn't go back the way he had come. His only option, however slim, was to push forward to try to find his way back to civilization, to find help. He started the car, wincing at how loud the engine sounded in the pre-dawn quiet, a beacon announcing his presence to anyone who might be listening. He chose a direction almost at random, guided by a faint sense of hope and the position of the rising sun, hoping it would lead him to a main road, a town, anywhere with people and hopefully safety. After about an hour of cautious driving, navigating the network of narrow, unpaved country lanes, avoiding the main highways where he feared his pursuers might be lying in wait, Noah finally saw signs of civilization. A small town, its buildings silhouetted against the brightening sky, appeared on the horizon, a glimmer of hope in the vast emptiness. But as he approached, that glimmer of hope was quickly extinguished, replaced by a renewed surge of fear and dread. There, parked prominently in front of the town's only gas station, was the rust-covered pickup truck, the vehicle that had haunted his rearview mirror for so many terrifying hours. Noah didn't slow down. He didn't even consider stopping. He sped through the town as fast as he dared, his heart pounding, praying that no one would recognize his car, that no one would give chase. In his rearview mirror, he saw a figure emerge from the gas station, pointing in his direction. Moments later, the truck's engine roared to life, and the chase began anew. He pushed his aging Civic to its absolute limits, taking turns at dangerous speeds, weaving through the quiet streets, constantly scanning his mirrors, desperately seeking any opportunity to lose his relentless pursuers. But they seemed to know the area intimately, anticipating his every move, always managing to stay on his tail. It wasn't until Noah crossed the state line into Colorado, entering the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, that he finally, miraculously, managed to shake them. The mountainous terrain, with its winding roads and steep inclines, provided cover, and the smaller size and greater maneuverability of his car finally gave him an advantage. By the time he reached Denver, hours later, Noah was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, utterly terrified, and completely paranoid. He went straight to the police station, but his story, recounted in a shaky, adrenaline-fueled rush, sounded improbable, almost insane, even to his own ears. A mysterious group of men, chasing him across multiple states, for no apparent reason? The officers were, understandably, skeptical. They took his statement, promised to investigate, but Noah could sense their disbelief, their unspoken assumption that he was exaggerating, or perhaps even delusional. He couldn't blame them. If someone had told him this story a week ago, before his life had taken this terrifying turn, he wouldn't have believed it either. In the end, Noah abandoned his meticulously planned road trip, his dreams of exploring the country shattered. He sold his beloved Honda Civic, a painful decision but a necessary one. The car felt tainted, a constant reminder of his ordeal. He bought a plane ticket and flew back home to Boston, constantly looking over his shoulder in the airport, half expecting to see those menacing men appear at any moment. Back in the familiar, relatively safe environment of his city life, Noah tried to resume his normal routine. But something fundamental had shifted within him. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being hunted. He became hyper-aware of his surroundings, constantly scanning for potential threats, always planning escape routes, his mind a whirlwind of what-ifs and worst-case scenarios. Months passed, and slowly, gradually, the acute fear began to fade, replaced by a lingering unease, a chronic sense of vulnerability. But the experience had left its mark, an indelible scar on his psyche. He never found out who those men were, or why they had pursued him with such relentless determination. Perhaps it was a case of mistaken identity, or maybe he had unknowingly witnessed something he shouldn't have at that first fateful gas station. He would likely never know the truth. What he did know was that the open road, once a symbol of freedom and limitless possibility, now filled him with a profound sense of dread. The vast expanse of America, which he had so longed to explore, now seemed like a dangerous, unpredictable place where anyone at any time could become a target. He still travels occasionally, but never by car and never alone. The cross-country road trip of his dreams has become a recurring nightmare he can't seem to shake. And every time he sees a rusty pickup truck in his rearview mirror, his heart skips a beat, his palms begin to sweat, and for a fleeting, terrifying moment, he's back on that dark, desolate highway, running for his life from an enemy he can't see, can't understand, and can't escape. The road may go on forever, stretching out towards the horizon, but for Noah, that particular journey is irrevocably over. Some adventures, he has learned, are best left to the realm of imagination. Island of unnatural selection. They say that curiosity killed the cat, But the old adage fails to mention the perilous fate that can befall inquisitive marine biology students who stumble upon their mentors' deeply buried, profoundly disturbing secrets. I journeyed to that remote, windswept island seeking knowledge, a deeper understanding of marine life. Instead, I uncovered a horrifying truth: that sometimes the hunter, the dedicated scientist, can morph into the hunted, the prey, in a terrifying game of scientific hubris gone horribly wrong. It was presented as the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance to learn from a giant in my chosen field. When Dr. Alistair Leopold, a marine biologist of international renown, invited me to assist with his research on a secluded island off the coast of Washington state, I accepted with unbridled enthusiasm. His work on deep-sea ecosystems was considered groundbreaking, revolutionary, and the prospect of studying under his tutelage was a dream come true for a graduate student like myself, still wet behind the ears. The island itself was diminutive, almost insignificant, barely a speck on most nautical charts. As our small, chartered research vessel approached, I could make out the research station, a cluster of utilitarian, prefabricated buildings perched precariously on the rocky shoreline. They looked almost alien, incongruous, against the backdrop of the rugged, untamed landscape. Dr. Leopold himself was waiting on the makeshift dock to greet us, his face deeply tanned and weathered, etched with the lines of countless hours spent under the sun and wind. He offered a warm, welcoming smile, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Welcome to Isla Perdida, Miss Bennett," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, extending a calloused hand to help me disembark. "I trust you're prepared for some demanding work and, I hope, some extraordinary discoveries." The first few weeks were everything I had dared to hope for, and more. We spent our days meticulously collecting samples from the surrounding waters, analyzing data in the well-equipped lab, and engaging in stimulating, intellectually challenging discussions about the intricacies of marine life. Dr. Leopold was undeniably brilliant, his passion for his work contagious, inspiring. I felt as though I was learning more in a single day than I had in entire semesters of formal academic study. However, as time wore on, I began to notice peculiarities. Small things, at first, easily dismissed, but cumulatively unsettling. Dr. Leopold had a habit of disappearing for hours at a time, offering no explanation for his absences. There was a locked room within the research station, a room that was strictly off-limits to everyone, including the other research assistants. And late at night, I sometimes heard strange, disturbing sounds, almost like distressed animal vocalizations, but unlike anything I'd ever encountered in my studies. When I tentatively inquired about these anomalies, the other researchers, a small, close-knit group, brushed off my concerns with practiced ease. "That's just how Dr. Leopold is," they'd say, shrugging. "He's eccentric, certainly, but he's also a genius. You'll get used to it." But I couldn't get used to it. The unease, the nagging sense of something being profoundly wrong, persisted, growing stronger with each passing day. My curiosity, the very trait that had driven me to pursue a career in marine biology, now gnawed at me, a relentless, insistent voice I couldn't ignore. One night, unable to sleep, plagued by a growing sense of dread, I decided to investigate. The research station was shrouded in silence, everyone else presumably sound asleep. I crept down the narrow hallway, my heart pounding in my chest, each creak of the floorboards seeming deafeningly loud in the stillness. As I approached the locked door, I heard it again, that strange, muffled cry, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. I knew it was wrong, a violation of protocol, perhaps even dangerous, but I had to know what was behind that door. Drawing upon skills I'd acquired during a somewhat misspent youth, skills I'd never imagined I'd use in a scientific setting, I managed to pick the lock. The door swung open silently, revealing a scene that would forever be seared into my memory. The room was filled with tanks, but these were not the ordinary aquariums one might expect in a marine research facility. Inside, swimming in murky, dimly lit water, were creatures I had never seen before, things that defied classification, that seemed to violate the natural order. Fish with too many eyes, their scales shimmering with an unnatural iridescence. Cephalopods with grotesquely enlarged brains, pulsating visibly beneath their translucent skin. Crustaceans with limbs that appeared disturbingly humanoid. And in the largest tank, at the far end of the room, something else resided. Something so alien, so utterly bizarre, that I struggled to even comprehend what I was seeing. A creature of shifting shapes and colors, its form constantly changing, its biology seemingly defying the known laws of nature. But it wasn't just the appearance of these creatures that horrified me. It was their condition. Many appeared to be sick, injured, or deformed, with visible surgical scars, evidence of invasive procedures, equipment that looked more at home in a Frankensteinian laboratory than a marine research facility lined the walls. Strange, gleaming instruments whose purpose I could only guess at, but which filled me with a profound sense of dread. This wasn't conservation. This wasn't scientific observation. This was experimentation. Twisted, unethical, and deeply disturbing. I was so engrossed in my horrified observations, so overwhelmed by the sheer wrongness of what I was witnessing, that I didn't hear the footsteps approaching behind me until it was too late. Fascinating, aren't they? Dr. Leopold's voice, usually so calm and reassuring, now held a chilling edge. I whirled around, my heart leaping into my throat. He stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed against the dim light of the hallway, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling mixture of pride and something else, something that sent a fresh wave of terror through me. I was wondering, he continued, his voice a low, almost hypnotic murmur, how long it would take your inquisitive nature to lead you here. Dr. Leopold, what is all this? I stammered, my voice trembling, gesturing weakly at the tanks filled with the grotesque, unnatural creatures. He stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind him with a soft, deliberate click that sent a shiver of dread down my spine. The sound echoed ominously in the confined space, sealing my fate. "This, Miss Bennett," he said, his voice taking on an almost evangelical fervor, "is the future of marine biology. These creatures, these marvels, represent evolutionary leaps that would take millions of years to occur naturally. But with a little guidance, a little intervention, we can accelerate the process. We can shape life itself." As he spoke, he moved slowly around the room, pausing before each tank, gazing at the creatures within with an almost fatherly affection, a disturbing pride that made my stomach churn. He seemed utterly oblivious to my horror, lost in his own twisted vision of scientific progress. "But this is wrong," I managed to say, finding my voice, though it was shaky and weak. "It's unethical. It's cruel." Dr. Leopold's face hardened, his expression shifting from one of almost paternal pride to cold, calculating assessment. "Cruel?" he repeated, the word dripping with disdain. "What's truly cruel, Miss Bennett, is the devastation that humanity has wreaked upon our oceans. The pollution, the overfishing, the climate change. These creatures," he gestured towards the tanks, "are the key to survival in a rapidly changing world. They are adapted to withstand conditions that would kill their natural counterparts. They are resistant to toxins, to temperature fluctuations, to increased acidity." He turned to face me, his eyes burning with a fanatic intensity that was both terrifying and deeply unsettling. "Don't you see? This isn't about playing God, Miss Bennett. This is about saving the oceans. By creating life that can withstand what we've done to them, we are ensuring the future of our planet." I shook my head, backing away slowly, desperately trying to maintain a semblance of composure in the face of his chilling pronouncements. "This isn't saving anything," I retorted, my voice gaining a little strength. It's monstrous. It's an abomination." For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a flicker of doubt, a hint of uncertainty, cross his face. But it was quickly extinguished, replaced by a cold, implacable resolve. "I had hoped," he said, a sigh escaping his lips. That you would understand, that you would appreciate the profound significance of this work, that you would see the necessity of it. He paused, his gaze locking onto mine, his eyes devoid of any warmth or compassion. But if you cannot, he shrugged, a gesture of chilling indifference. Well, I'm afraid I can't allow you to leave this island. The implicit threat hung heavy in the air, a suffocating weight pressing down on me. My mind raced, desperately seeking an escape route, a way out of this rapidly escalating nightmare. But I was trapped on a remote island, miles from civilization, with a man I now realized was dangerously insane, surrounded by a small, complicit team who either shared his twisted vision or were too terrified to oppose him. What are you going to do? I asked, struggling to keep my voice from cracking, from betraying the sheer terror that gripped me. Dr. Leopold smiled, but it was a cold, clinical smile, devoid of any genuine warmth or humanity. Do? He repeated, his voice almost a whisper. Why, I'm going to give you the extraordinary opportunity to contribute to science in the most profound way possible. Your young, healthy body. It will be perfect for my next series of experiments. Terror, cold and paralyzing, surged through me. I looked around frantically, desperately searching for something, anything, I could use as a weapon, a means of defense. But before I could make a move, before I could even formulate a coherent plan, I felt a sharp, stinging prick in my neck. I turned to see one of the other researchers, a young man named Thomas, standing behind me, an empty syringe in his hand, his face a mask of conflicted emotions, a mixture of guilt, fear, and a strange, unsettling resignation. I'm sorry, he mumbled, his voice barely audible, avoiding my gaze. But the work, it's too important. As the sedative began to take effect, my legs buckled beneath me, my vision blurring. The last thing I saw, before darkness enveloped me, was Dr. Leopold leaning over me, his face a mask of cold, scientific curiosity, a scalpel gleaming in his hand. I don't know how long I remained unconscious, lost in a drug-induced oblivion. When I finally began to regain my senses, it was to a reality far more terrifying than any nightmare. I was strapped to a cold metal table, my limbs secured by thick leather restraints. The room, dimly lit by harsh fluorescent lights, resembled a grotesque hybrid of an operating theater and a mad scientist's laboratory from a low-budget horror film. The other researchers, including Thomas, who had administered the sedative, were present, busily preparing instruments and equipment, their movements precise and practiced, but their faces carefully averted, avoiding my gaze. They moved like automatons, their humanity seemingly suppressed, replaced by a chilling obedience to Dr. Leopold's twisted will. Dr. Leopold himself loomed over me, his expression one of detached, clinical interest. He held a scalpel in his hand, its polished blade glinting menacingly in the harsh light. "Don't worry, Miss Bennett," he said, his voice devoid of any empathy, any hint of remorse. He seemed to misinterpret my terrified expression as mere discomfort. "You won't feel a thing, and just think, you'll be part of something truly revolutionary, a contribution to science that will reshape the future of our oceans." As he lowered the scalpel, its razor-sharp edge drawing closer to my skin, I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the inevitable, for the agonizing pain, for the end. I was certain this was it. My life, my dreams, my future, all about to be extinguished in this remote, isolated laboratory, at the hands of a madman. But then, miraculously, unexpectedly, I heard a commotion outside the room. Shouting, in English this time, the unmistakable sound of breaking glass, the heavy thud of boots on the floor. "Dr. Leopold's head snapped up, his eyes widening in surprise, a flicker of fear crossing his face for the first time. "What the hell?" he muttered. The door to the laboratory burst open, and to my utter astonishment, to my profound relief, I saw men in Coast Guard uniforms pouring into the room, weapons drawn, their faces grim and determined. "Step away from the table," one of them shouted, his voice amplified by a bullhorn. "Hands where we can see them. Now!" In the ensuing chaos, the whirlwind of activity that followed, I learned what had transpired. My parents, understandably concerned when they hadn't heard from me in weeks, far longer than my usual intervals between communications, had contacted the authorities. When the Coast Guard had attempted to contact the research station and received no response, their suspicions had been aroused, prompting them to stage a raid, a desperate rescue mission. The next few days were a blur of debriefings, medical checkups, and lengthy, emotionally draining statements to law enforcement officials. Dr. Leopold and his team were arrested, taken into custody, charged with a litany of ethical violations and criminal acts that sent shockwaves through the scientific community. The grotesque, genetically modified creatures in the laboratory were seized by the government, their fate uncertain, a subject of intense debate among scientists, ethicists, and policymakers. As for me, I was hailed as a whistleblower, a hero, even though my discovery of Dr. Leopold's horrific experiments had been purely accidental, a consequence of my own insatiable curiosity and a deep-seated sense of unease. Journalists clamored for interviews. Documentary filmmakers sought to tell my story. It was overwhelming, disorienting, and, if I'm honest, more than a little frightening. Dr. Leopold's network, it turned out, extended far beyond that remote island, and there was always the nagging fear of retaliation, of unseen forces seeking to silence me. But more than that, I struggled with the profound psychological impact of what I had experienced, the knowledge of what I had witnessed. I had gazed into the abyss of scientific hubris, of unchecked ambition, and it had gazed back at me. The scientific community was rocked by the scandal, the revelations sparking heated debates about the ethics of genetic modification, the need for stricter oversight of remote research facilities, and the potential dangers of unchecked scientific ambition. My passion for marine biology, the driving force of my life, remained, but it was now tempered by a profound understanding of the responsibility that comes with scientific knowledge, the ethical boundaries that must never be crossed. I could no longer look at the ocean, at its vast, mysterious depths in the same way. I would always wonder what secrets it held, what hidden horrors might lurk beneath the surface, both natural and man-made. In the years that followed, I dedicated my career to ethical marine research and conservation, determined to protect the oceans without resorting to the monstrous methods I had witnessed on that isolated island. The nightmares, the chilling memories of my time on Isla Perdida, gradually faded, but I never forgot the vital lesson I had learned. That science, for all its potential for good, for progress, can be twisted, perverted into something dark and dangerous when divorced from ethics and compassion. It is the responsibility of each and every one of us within the scientific community, and indeed, within society as a whole, to remain vigilant, to question, to challenge, and to remember that our ultimate duty is not to our own ambitions, our own egos, or even to the pursuit of knowledge itself, but to the natural world we seek to understand and protect. The ocean still calls to me, its vastness and mystery still beckon, but now I hear in its waves a warning as well as an invitation, a reminder that the greatest monsters aren't always the ones with scales and fins, but sometimes the ones in lab coats, who have lost sight of the delicate, crucial line between discovery and destruction. Whispers in the wind, Hungarian horror. They say that eavesdroppers never hear anything good about themselves. That may be true, but what I overheard that star-dusted night in the Hungarian countryside wasn't about me. It was something far more sinister, something that transformed my peaceful, solitary camping trip into a desperate, heart-pounding fight for survival. I've always been drawn to the concept of stealth camping, the thrill of setting up camp in secluded, off-the-grid locations, far from designated campgrounds and the watchful eyes of park rangers. There's a certain rebellious freedom in it, a sense of connection with nature that's hard to find in more conventional settings. So, when I planned my backpacking excursion through Europe, I made it a point to include some off-the-beaten-path adventures, opportunities to truly immerse myself in the wilderness. Hungary wasn't initially on my meticulously crafted itinerary, but a fellow traveler I met in a bustling Vienna hostel raved about the unspoiled beauty of the Hungarian countryside, specifically recommending a remote, hidden gem. "There's this perfect spot," he'd said, enthusiastically marking a location on my well-worn map. "Totally secluded, incredible views. You'll absolutely love it." I should have been more skeptical. I should have known better than to blindly trust the advice of a stranger met in a hostel. But the allure of solitude, of pristine nature, was too strong to resist. The seed of adventure had been planted, and so I found myself on a rickety local bus, heading deep into the heart of rural Hungary, my backpack overflowing with camping gear and a few days' worth of provisions. The bus deposited me at the edge of a small, picturesque village that seemed frozen in time, a relic of a bygone era. Elderly women, their heads adorned with traditional scarves, watched me with a mixture of curiosity and mild suspicion as I adjusted my heavy backpack and consulted my map. I offered them a friendly smile and a wave, attempting to project an air of harmlessness, of non-threatening innocence, before setting off down a dusty, unpaved road that meandered into the rolling hills beyond the village. The hike was breathtaking. Fields of golden wheat, ripe for harvest, swayed gently in the warm breeze, punctuated by vibrant splashes of wildflowers. In the distance, I could see dense, verdant forests crowning the hills, promising further exploration. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long, dramatic shadows across the landscape, I finally located the spot my fellow traveler had so enthusiastically recommended. And he had been right. It was perfect. A small, naturally formed clearing on the edge of the forest, overlooking a vast, sprawling valley. The panoramic view was stunning, the Hungarian countryside bathed in the warm, golden light of the setting sun. I quickly, efficiently set up my tent, a familiar, almost meditative ritual, and prepared a simple, satisfying dinner on my portable camping stove, feeling a profound sense of peace and contentment wash over me. As darkness enveloped the landscape, I crawled into my tent, exhausted from the day's hike but deeply, utterly at peace. The only sounds were the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze, the occasional hoot of an owl, the soft crackling of embers from my dying campfire. I drifted off to sleep, anticipating further exploration of this beautiful, tranquil corner of the world. I'm not entirely sure what woke me. Perhaps it was some deeply ingrained primal instinct, a sixth sense warning of impending danger. But suddenly, I was wide awake, my heart pounding in my chest, every nerve on high alert. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Then I heard them, voices, men's voices, speaking in low, urgent tones. They were close, incredibly close, just on the other side of the thin nylon fabric of my tent. I held my breath, straining to listen, my body rigid with fear. The voices were speaking in Hungarian, a language I didn't understand, but their tone, their inflection, was unmistakable. They were angry, agitated, their words laced with a palpable tension. I caught a few scattered words that sounded like English names, perhaps, and the word American, repeated several times. Slowly, carefully, my hand shaking, I peered out of a small mesh window in my tent. In the pale moonlight, I could make out the silhouettes of 3 men, standing just a few yards away. They were dressed in dark clothing, and even in the dim light, I could see that they were armed. One of them was gesturing emphatically, jabbing his finger at what appeared to be a map spread out on the ground. I ducked back inside, my mind racing, a whirlwind of panic and confusion. Who were these men? What were they doing out here, in the middle of nowhere, in the dead of night? And why did they sound so angry, so threatening? When they mentioned Americans, I knew with a chilling certainty that I needed to get out of there. Immediately. But how? My tent, my flimsy shelter, was the only thing separating me from these armed men. If I tried to pack up, to make any sudden movements, they would hear me for sure. As I frantically weighed my options, my desperate calculations were interrupted by a sound that sent a wave of pure, unadulterated terror through me. The metallic click of a gun being cocked, followed by words I did understand, spoken with chilling clarity. Check the tent. There was no time for deliberation, no time for careful planning. Instinct, pure and primal, took over. I grabbed my backpack, which thankfully contained most of my essential gear, and with trembling hands, I unzipped the back of my tent, a small, rarely used access panel, as silently as I possibly could. I slipped out into the darkness, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I had barely taken 2 steps when I heard shouts behind me, confirming my worst fears. They had discovered my presence, or at least my absence from the tent. I ran. I ran like I'd never run before, crashing blindly through the undergrowth, branches whipping at my face, tearing at my clothes. I could hear them behind me, their heavy footsteps pounding on the earth, their angry shouts echoing through the silent forest, spurring me on, fueling my desperate flight. I had absolutely no idea where I was going. The moonlight, which had seemed so beautiful, so serene just hours before, now cast confusing, deceptive shadows, making every tree, every bush, look identical. The forest, once a place of peace and tranquility, had become a terrifying labyrinth. But I didn't dare stop, didn't dare pause to get my bearings. I just kept running, driven by pure, unadulterated adrenaline and the primal instinct to survive. At one point, a gunshot rang out, the sharp, deafening crack echoing through the hills. I ducked instinctively, nearly losing my footing on the uneven terrain. They were shooting at me. This wasn't some misunderstanding, some case of mistaken identity. These men wanted me dead. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in that desperate, terrifying flight. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, each second an eternity. But eventually, gradually, I realized I could no longer hear them. The sounds of pursuit, the crashing footsteps, the angry shouts had faded into the distance. I slowed down, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest, and allowed myself to collapse against the rough bark of a large tree, trying to catch my breath, to regain some semblance of composure, while still listening intently for any sign of my pursuers. Nothing, only the sound of my own ragged breathing, the frantic beating of my heart, and the natural, nocturnal sounds of the forest, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. As the adrenaline began to slowly recede, the full weight of my situation, the sheer precariousness of my predicament, crashed down on me. I was lost, alone, in a foreign country, in the middle of the night, with no idea where I was or where to go. And somewhere out there, armed men were actively hunting for me. I needed to find help. But where? I couldn't go back to the village. For all I knew, these men could be from that village. I had no phone signal, no way to contact the authorities, no way to call for assistance. I was utterly, completely on my own. As the first faint light of dawn began to filter through the dense canopy of trees, painting the eastern sky in pale shades of gray and pink, I made a decision. I needed to keep moving. Staying in one place, exposed and vulnerable, was too risky. I oriented myself using the rising sun, a rudimentary but essential navigational skill, and started walking, hoping against hope to find a road, a house, anything that might lead to safety, to civilization. The day wore on, an agonizingly slow progression. I kept walking, my feet blistered and aching, my body exhausted, my throat parched with thirst. But fear, the constant, gnawing fear of being discovered, kept me going. Every snapping twig made me jump. Every distant sound sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. It was late afternoon, the sun already beginning to dip towards the horizon, when I finally heard something that gave me a flicker of hope, the distant, unmistakable rumble of a vehicle. I moved towards the sound, cautiously, warily, my senses on high alert, ready to dive for cover at the first sign of danger. I emerged from the trees to find a narrow, paved road, and there, in the distance, was a car approaching. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding. What if it was them? But I was out of options. I was desperate. I needed help. I stepped out onto the road and waved my arms frantically, a desperate plea for assistance. The car, an old, battered Fiat, slowed to a stop. An elderly couple peered out at me, their faces a mixture of concern and wary apprehension. In my broken, rudimentary Hungarian, supplemented with a lot of frantic gesturing and pleading expressions, I tried to explain my situation, to convey the urgency of my predicament. The woman's eyes softened, and she said something to her husband in rapid Hungarian. He nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes, and they motioned for me to get in. As we drove, I tried to explain more fully what had happened, but the language barrier was a significant obstacle. They seemed to understand, however, that I was in some kind of serious trouble, that I was frightened and needed help. The woman patted my hand reassuringly, a gesture of simple human kindness that brought tears to my eyes. They took me to the nearest police station, in a small town whose name I didn't even catch. There, with the assistance of a translator, I was finally able to tell my story in its entirety. The police, initially skeptical, a foreign tourist claiming to have been chased through the forest by armed men sounded like something out of a far-fetched thriller, began to take me more seriously as they investigated. It turned out there had been reports of smuggling activity in the area, criminal gangs using the remote countryside to move contraband across borders. The men I had encountered were likely part of this operation, and I had, unfortunately, stumbled into the wrong place at the wrong time. The next few days were a blur of police statements, embassy visits, and arrangements to return home. I was shaken, exhausted, and more than ready to leave Hungary behind, to put as much distance as possible between myself and that terrifying night. As I sat in the airport, waiting for my flight, I couldn't help but reflect on how quickly, how drastically, things had changed. One moment, I was enjoying a peaceful night under the stars, immersed in the beauty of nature. The next, I was running for my life through an unfamiliar forest, pursued by armed men. The experience irrevocably altered me. I still love to travel, still feel the undeniable pull of adventure, but I now approach it with a heightened sense of caution, a more acute awareness of the potential dangers that can lurk even in the most picturesque, seemingly tranquil settings. I learned, in the most visceral way possible, that the world can be a dangerous place, that the line between safety and peril is often razor-thin and easily crossed. But I also learned about the profound kindness of strangers, the unexpected compassion of that elderly couple who, without hesitation, offered assistance to a frightened, disheveled foreigner on a lonely road. That memory, that act of simple human decency, helps to balance the darkness of the other. As my flight took off, I gazed down at the Hungarian countryside receding below, its beauty now tinged with a sense of menace. I knew what secrets could be hidden within those rolling hills and dense forests. I had seen the darkness that can lurk beneath the postcard-perfect surface, and it was a lesson I would carry with me always. The thrill of stealth camping has lost its luster. These days, I stick to designated campgrounds, places with other people nearby, a sense of communal safety. Because I know now that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the wilderness isn't the wildlife or the elements, it's other people. And in those remote, isolated places, where help is far away and the normal rules of society seem to fray, a simple misunderstanding, a wrong turn, can escalate into a life-or-death struggle in the blink of an eye. I still have nightmares sometimes, vivid dreams of running through endless, dark forests, unseen pursuers always just a breath behind. But I also dream of that elderly couple, of the kindness in the woman's eyes as she took my hand, and I try to hold onto that, the reminder that even in our darkest moments, even in the face of unimaginable terror, there is still goodness in the world, still people willing to extend a helping hand to a stranger in need. It's a delicate balance, I've discovered, between embracing adventure and exercising caution, between trusting others and protecting oneself. Finding that balance isn't always easy, but it's a journey I'm committed to, one careful, mindful step at a time. the lens of deception, the golden rule of wildlife photography, drilled into every aspiring naturalist with a camera, is to observe and document, but never interfere with the natural order. But what happens when the most significant threat to that natural order isn't a predator in the wild, but the insidious greed of man? What happens when you find yourself caught in a deadly crossfire between the last vestiges of a dying species and those who profit from their demise? I learned the answer on the vast, sun-drenched plains of South Africa, where my passion for capturing the beauty of wildlife on film nearly cost me my life. I dreamt of a South African safari since childhood, captivated by images of majestic elephants, graceful giraffes, and powerful lions roaming free in their natural habitat. The idea of capturing these creatures on film, of preserving their raw beauty for posterity, had become an all-consuming passion. So, when I finally accumulated sufficient savings to finance the trip, I splurged on a specialized photography safari, one that promised an authentic, off-the-beaten-path experience, far removed from the well-trodden tourist routes. The initial days of the safari were nothing short of magical, exceeding even my wildest expectations. We witnessed elephants bathing in muddy waterholes, their wrinkled hides glistening in the sun. We observed prides of lions lounging languidly in the shade of acacia trees, their golden eyes gleaming with predatory intelligence. We even caught a glimpse of a pair of elusive leopards, their spotted coats blending seamlessly with the dappled shadows of the bush. Each click of my camera shutter felt like a small act of preservation, a way of capturing and sharing the untamed beauty of this incredible corner of the world. Our guide, a local man named Thabo, was a walking encyclopedia of knowledge about the African bush. His eyes would light up as he shared fascinating stories about the animals, their behaviors, and the delicate balance of the ecosystem. "Remember," he'd often say, his voice low and earnest, "we are merely guests here. We observe, we appreciate, but we never interfere." His words resonated deeply with me, reinforcing my own commitment to ethical wildlife photography. On the fourth day of the safari, Thabo announced that he had a special treat in store for us. "I know of a place," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "where we might have a chance to see rhinos. It's a bit off the usual routes, a bit more challenging to reach, but it's well worth the effort." The prospect of photographing these magnificent, endangered creatures, these prehistoric giants, was incredibly exciting. We set off at dawn, our rugged safari vehicle bumping and swaying along barely discernible tracks, leaving the familiar tourist routes far behind. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, painting the vast savanna in vibrant hues of gold and amber, Thabo brought the vehicle to a halt. "We'll proceed on foot from here," he whispered, his eyes constantly scanning the surrounding landscape. "Remember absolute silence. Rhinos have relatively poor eyesight, but their hearing is exceptionally acute." My heart pounded with a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation as I followed Thabo and the other members of our small group into the bush. The dry grass crunched softly under our feet, the only sound breaking the stillness of the African morning. After about 15 minutes of careful, deliberate stalking, Thabo raised a hand, signaling us to stop. He pointed silently, his finger directing our gaze towards a small clearing in the distance. And there they were, a small crash of white rhinos, their massive, gray bodies starkly silhouetted against the golden backdrop of the savanna, their iconic horns gleaming in the sunlight. It was a photographer's dream, a scene of breathtaking beauty and raw power. I raised my camera, my hands trembling slightly with excitement, carefully adjusting the settings, composing the shot. Just as I was about to press the shutter button, a sharp, explosive crack echoed across the open plain. It sounded unmistakably like a gunshot. The rhinos, startled by the sudden noise, scattered, disappearing into the dense bush with surprising speed and agility for creatures of their size. Tabo's face had gone pale, his expression a mixture of fear and grim determination. "Poachers," he hissed, his voice barely audible. "We need to get out of here, now." But curiosity, a reckless, misplaced sense of duty, overrode my common sense, my instinct for self-preservation. "We should report this," I whispered back, my voice shaking. "If we can get evidence." Tabo shook his head vehemently, his eyes wide with alarm. "No, it's too dangerous." But I was already moving, creeping stealthily towards the direction from which the gunshot had originated. Reluctantly, Tabo followed, his body tense, his senses on high alert. As we neared a small, partially concealed clearing, I heard voices, men speaking in hushed, urgent tones. I cautiously peered around the trunk of a large acacia tree, and my blood ran cold. For men stood in the clearing, armed with high-powered rifles. But it was what lay at their feet that truly horrified me, that sent a wave of nausea and revulsion washing over me. A rhino, its magnificent horn brutally, callously hacked off, its lifeblood staining the dusty ground a sickening crimson. Without thinking, driven by a surge of outrage and a desperate need to document this horrific scene, I raised my camera and started shooting. The rapid-fire click, click, click of the shutter seemed deafeningly loud in the tense silence. One of the men's heads snapped up, his eyes, cold and ruthless, locking onto mine. For a heartbeat, a frozen moment in time, we stared at each other, the hunter and the witness. Then all hell broke loose. "Run!" Tabo yelled, grabbing my arm and yanking me away from the scene, his voice filled with a desperate urgency. We crashed through the dense, thorny bush, thorns tearing at our clothes, branches whipping at our faces, leaving stinging welts. Behind us, I could hear shouts, angry curses, and the terrifying sound of pursuit. My lungs burned, my legs felt like lead, but the primal fear of being caught, of facing the same fate as that slaughtered rhino, kept me moving. Tabo, with his intimate knowledge of the terrain, was a few paces ahead, guiding us through the treacherous landscape. A gunshot rang out, the bullet splintering the bark off a tree mere inches from my head. I ducked instinctively, nearly losing my footing on the uneven ground. "Keep going," Tabo urged, his voice strained, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Don't stop." We ran for what felt like an eternity, the sounds of pursuit sometimes fading, sometimes growing alarmingly close. As darkness began to descend, cloaking the bush in deep shadows, the landscape became even more treacherous, a bewildering maze of thorns, rocks, and hidden dangers. Every sound, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent a jolt of terror through me. Finally, after what seemed like an endless, agonizing flight, Tabo pulled me into a small, concealed cave formed by an overhanging rock formation. We crouched there, hidden in the darkness, our breathing ragged and uneven, straining our ears for any sign of the approaching poachers. What do we do now?" I whispered, once I had managed to catch my breath, my voice trembling with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. Tabo's face was grim, his expression etched with worry in the dim, filtered light. "We wait," he said, his voice low and serious. "The park rangers, they'll be looking for us by now, but so will the poachers. If they find us first." He didn't need to finish the sentence. The unspoken threat hung heavy in the air. The night stretched on, an endless, agonizing expanse of time punctuated by fear and uncertainty. Every sound, every rustle of leaves, every distant animal call made us tense, expecting to see the barrel of a rifle, the menacing silhouettes of our pursuers, appear at any moment. I clutched my camera, the precious evidence it contained now a dangerous burden, a liability that could cost us our lives. As the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the dense canopy of trees, we heard a new sound, the distant, rhythmic whup-whup-whup of helicopter blades. Hope, fragile and tentative, surged through me. But Tabo remained cautious, his senses on high alert. "It could be the park rangers," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Or it could be the poachers' buyers coming to collect the horn. We can't risk moving until we're certain." So we waited, our nerves stretched taut, the sound of the helicopter growing louder, then fading, then returning. It was a maddening, agonizing suspense, not knowing whether salvation or doom was approaching. Suddenly, a voice crackled through a megaphone, barely audible above the thrum of the rotor blades, but unmistakably speaking in English. "This is Kruger National Park Rangers. If you can hear this, signal your location." Relief, profound and overwhelming, washed over me. But Tabo, ever cautious, still held me back. "Wait," he cautioned, his voice tense. "It could be a trick." But as the voice repeated the message, this time specifically mentioning my name and Tabo's, we knew, with a certainty that banished all doubt, that it was genuine. Rescue had arrived. We stumbled out of our hiding place, waving our arms frantically, shouting at the top of our lungs. The helicopter spotted us almost immediately, its powerful searchlight illuminating our figures. It landed in a nearby clearing, kicking up a cloud of dust and debris. As park rangers, armed and alert, poured out of the helicopter, scanning the surrounding bush for threats, I felt my knees buckle beneath me. It was over. We were safe. The debriefing at park headquarters was intense, a whirlwind of questions, statements, and official procedures. I handed over my camera, the photographs I had taken, those fleeting, terrifying images captured in the poacher's clearing, now crucial pieces of evidence in the ongoing battle against the illegal wildlife trade. The park director, a stern-faced woman named Miriam, looked at me with a mixture of admiration and exasperation. "You took an incredibly foolish risk, Miss Bennett," she said, her tone softening slightly. "A reckless, potentially fatal risk. But these photos, they could make a real difference. We've suspected for some time that there was a large-scale poaching operation active in this part of the park, but we've never had concrete, irrefutable evidence until now." In the days that followed, as I gave formal statements to police investigators and park officials, the full scope of what I had inadvertently stumbled upon began to emerge. The poachers were part of a sophisticated, well-organized international syndicate with connections reaching into the highest echelons of government and business. My photographs, along with Tabo's invaluable eyewitness testimony, provided the missing link, the crucial piece of the puzzle that authorities needed to launch a major, coordinated operation. Within weeks, arrests were made not just of the low-level poachers we had encountered, but also of corrupt officials, wealthy buyers, and the shadowy figures who orchestrated the entire brutal enterprise. As for me, I found myself unexpectedly thrust into the spotlight, hailed as a hero by conservation groups, interviewed by journalists, approached by documentary filmmakers eager to tell my story. It was overwhelming, disorienting, and, if I'm honest, more than a little frightening. The poaching syndicate had long arms and deep pockets, and there was always the nagging, unsettling fear of retaliation, of becoming a target once again. But more than that, I struggled with the complex moral implications of my actions, with the knowledge of what I had, however inadvertently, set in motion. Yes, dangerous criminals had been apprehended, and perhaps some rhinos would be spared a gruesome fate, at least for a time. But I also knew that for every poacher arrested, there were countless others, driven by poverty, desperation, and lack of opportunity, waiting to take their place. The root causes of the problem, the insatiable demand for rhino horn in certain parts of the world, the stark economic inequalities that fueled the illegal trade, remained largely unaddressed. The experience changed me, profoundly and irrevocably. I couldn't simply return to being an amateur wildlife photographer, a casual observer, not after what I had witnessed, what I had lived through. I began working with wildlife conservation organizations, using my images and my story to raise awareness about the devastating impact of poaching, about the urgent need for more effective protection of endangered species. I returned to Kruger National Park a year later, this time not as a tourist, but as part of an anti-poaching education initiative, working with local communities to promote sustainable tourism and provide alternative livelihoods. The park felt different now, still breathtakingly beautiful, still teeming with wildlife, but with an underlying current of vulnerability, of fragility, that I hadn't noticed before. Tabo had been promoted to head ranger, his bravery and quick thinking during our harrowing ordeal formally recognized by park management. When we met again, there was a bond between us, a shared understanding that transcended words, forged in those terrifying hours of flight and hiding, of facing death together. As we stood together one evening, watching the sun set over the vast African savanna, a family of rhinos grazing peacefully in the distance, Tabo turned to me, a wry smile playing on his lips. "You know," he said, "most people come to Africa to shoot animals with their cameras. You managed to shoot down an entire poaching ring." I laughed, but it was a laugh tinged with the weight of all that had happened, with the knowledge of the ongoing struggle, the constant threat that still loomed over these magnificent creatures. My camera hung at my side, a familiar weight, a reminder of the power and the profound responsibility that comes with bearing witness, with capturing the truth, however dangerous that truth may be. The African bush stretched out before us, vast and beautiful, but also dangerous, a world of vibrant life and ever-present death. I raised my camera, focusing on the rhinos, marveling at their prehistoric silhouettes against the fiery backdrop of the setting sun. As I pressed the shutter, the familiar click seemed to echo with a new, deeper meaning. Each photograph was no longer just an image, a pretty picture. It was a testament, a call to action, a reminder of what's at stake in the ongoing fight to preserve the wild places and creatures of our world. The light faded, and darkness crept across the land. But in that moment, watching over the rhinos with a friend who had become a brother, I felt a flicker of fierce, unwavering hope. The night was full of dangers, yes, but the dawn would come, and we would be there to greet it, cameras in hand, ready to continue the fight, to capture and protect the wild, beating heart of Africa. The cruise ship conspiracy, the gentle, rhythmic rocking of a cruise ship, the vast expanse of the ocean stretching out to the horizon. These are supposed to evoke feelings of relaxation, of escape, of carefree adventure. But when you witness a brutal murder at sea, that peaceful sway becomes the unsettling rhythm of a nightmare from which there is no awakening, a constant reminder of the darkness lurking beneath the glittering surface. I'd always dreamt of experiencing a Caribbean cruise, the quintessential tropical getaway. The idea of sailing through turquoise waters, visiting exotic islands, and indulging in endless buffets and dazzling entertainment seemed like the perfect antidote to the relentless grind of my mundane office job. So, when I finally booked my passage on the majestic Serenity, a luxurious liner promising the ultimate vacation experience, I was ecstatic, my mind filled with visions of sun-drenched beaches and carefree relaxation. The first few days of the cruise were everything I'd hoped for, and more. I lounged by the sparkling pool, sipping colorful cocktails and engaging in casual conversations with fellow passengers. I tried my luck at the onboard casino, losing a modest sum but enjoying the thrill of the games. I attended dazzling Broadway-style shows in the evenings, marveling at the talent and spectacle. And I ate and ate and ate more food than I thought humanly possible, indulging in the seemingly endless array of culinary delights. It was, in a word, paradise. On the fourth night of the cruise, I decided to take a late-night stroll on the upper deck, seeking a moment of solitude and fresh air. The air was warm and balmy, carrying the salty tang of the ocean. The moon, nearly full, cast a shimmering, silvery path across the dark, gently undulating waters. Most of the other passengers were either sound asleep in their cabins or enjoying the lively atmosphere of the ship's nightclub, leaving the deck blissfully deserted. As I rounded a corner, heading towards the bow of the ship, I heard voices, raised voices, emanating from one of the smaller, more intimate lounges. Curiosity, that ever-present human impulse, got the better of me, and I slowed my pace, straining to hear what was being said. "You can't do this!" A man's voice, panicked and pleading, exclaimed. We had a deal. Deals change." Another voice replied, cold, menacing, and utterly devoid of compassion. "You should have known better than to try and double-cross us, Daniel." I edged closer to the partially open door of the lounge, my heart rate accelerating with each word I overheard. This was clearly more than just a heated disagreement. It was something far more sinister. "Please," the first voice, now desperate, almost sobbing, begged. "I'll get you the money. I need more time." "Time's up," the second voice said, flatly, irrevocably. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion, a horrifying tableau witnessed through the narrow gap of the ajar door. I peered inside, just in time to see a tall man, dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit, grab the other man, Daniel, by the throat. There was a flash of metallic silver, a knife. I realized with a sickening jolt, a muffled cry, a choked gurgle, and then the sickening thud of a body collapsing to the floor. I instinctively clapped a hand over my mouth to stifle a gasp, stumbling backward, my mind reeling, struggling to process the sheer horror of what I had just witnessed. A murder. I had just seen a man murdered. For a moment, I stood frozen, paralyzed by fear and disbelief, unsure what to do, how to react. Then, I heard movement from inside the lounge, the sound of footsteps approaching the door. Panic, raw and overwhelming, seized me. I turned and ran. My bare feet slapped against the smooth, polished deck as I fled, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I ran back to my cabin, my sanctuary, my only refuge. Once inside, I frantically locked the door, sinking to the floor, my body trembling uncontrollably. What should I do? Alert the ship's security? But what if the killer had connections on board? What if he was part of the crew, or worse, someone in a position of authority? On a cruise ship, in the middle of the ocean, there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. I was utterly, terrifyingly vulnerable. I spent the remainder of the night in a state of heightened alert, jumping at every creak of the ship, every muffled sound in the corridor outside my cabin. Sleep was impossible, my mind replaying the horrific scene I had witnessed over and over again, each replay amplifying my fear and paranoia. By morning, exhausted and emotionally drained, but driven by a sense of desperate urgency, I knew I had to tell someone. I couldn't simply pretend I hadn't seen anything. A man had been murdered, and I was the only witness. I made my way to the purser's desk, constantly glancing over my shoulder, my senses on high alert. The cheerful young woman behind the counter greeted me with a bright, practiced smile. "Good morning, sir. How may I assist you today?" I leaned in close, lowering my voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "I need to speak with security," I said, my voice trembling slightly. It's urgent." Her smile faltered momentarily, but she maintained her professional composure. "Of course, sir," she replied. "May I ask what this is regarding?" I hesitated, suddenly acutely aware of how improbable, how outlandish my story might sound. I witnessed something last night," I stammered. "Something terrible." She nodded, her expression turning serious, her eyes conveying a mixture of concern and professional detachment. "I understand, sir. If you'll just wait here a moment, I'll have our head of security come and speak with you." As I waited, my paranoia intensified. What if the killer had seen me? What if he was watching me right now, plotting his next move? What if the ship's security was somehow complicit, part of a larger conspiracy? A tall, broad-shouldered man, impeccably dressed in a crisp white uniform, approached me. "Sir," he said, his voice calm and authoritative, "I'm Chief Thompson, head of security for the Majestic Serenity. I understand you have something to report." I nodded, glancing around nervously, ensuring we weren't being overheard. "Last night," I began, my voice low and hesitant, I saw a murder in the Starlight Lounge." Chief Thompson's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained otherwise impassive. "A murder, sir?" he repeated. "Are you absolutely certain?" I recounted everything I had seen and heard, my words tumbling out in a rush, a torrent of fear and disbelief. As I spoke, the chief listened intently, his gaze unwavering, his expression unreadable. "This is a very serious accusation, Mr. Peterson," he said when I had finished, his voice grave. "We'll need to investigate immediately. Please, come with me." He led me to a small, nondescript office, tucked away from the public areas of the ship, and asked me to wait while he assembled his team. As I sat there, alone with my racing thoughts, my anxiety escalated. What if they didn't believe me? What if the killer had already disposed of the body, erased all traces of the crime? When Chief Thompson returned, he was accompanied by 2 other security officers, their faces equally serious. I repeated my story, answering their detailed, probing questions as best I could, trying to recall every minute detail, every nuance of what I had witnessed. "We'll conduct a thorough search of the Starlight Lounge and the surrounding areas," Chief Thompson assured me. "In the meantime, Mr. Peterson, I must ask you to keep this information strictly confidential. We don't want to cause unnecessary panic among the other passengers." I nodded, relieved that they were taking my claims seriously, but still deeply unsettled, my sense of security shattered. As I left the security office, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that unseen eyes were following my every move. The rest of the day passed in a blur of anxiety and paranoia. I tried to go about my normal vacation activities, to blend in with the other passengers, but it was impossible. Every face I saw seemed potentially suspicious, every smile a possible mask concealing dark secrets. Was that man by the pool the killer? Did that woman in the buffet line know something she wasn't saying? By evening, I was a nervous wreck, jumping at every announcement over the ship's public address system, half expecting it to be news of a body discovered, of a murder investigation underway. But nothing came. As I picked at my dinner in the main dining room, feeling utterly alone despite being surrounded by hundreds of other passengers, a hand landed lightly on my shoulder. I nearly jumped out of my skin, my heart leaping into my throat. "Sir?" It was one of the security officers from earlier, the one who had accompanied Chief Thompson. "Chief Thompson would like to see you," he said, his voice neutral, his expression unreadable. My heart pounded in my chest as I followed him back to the security office. Was this it? Had they found something? Or had the killer discovered my identity and reported me? Chief Thompson was waiting, his face a mask of professional detachment. "Mr. Peterson," he began once we were seated, "we've conducted a thorough, exhaustive search of the Starlight Lounge and all surrounding areas. I'm afraid we found no evidence whatsoever of any crime having taken place." I stared at him in disbelief, my mind reeling. "But I saw it," I protested, my voice rising in desperation. "I heard it. The man. He was killed." Chief Thompson held up a hand, a gesture of calm authority. "I understand that you believe what you saw was real, Mr. Peterson," he said, his voice softening slightly. "But we've reviewed all available security footage, interviewed numerous staff members who were on duty last night, and found absolutely nothing to corroborate your story." "The footage," I said, grasping at straws, desperate for some validation, some proof. Can I see it? Maybe I can point out the men I saw." The chief shook his head firmly. "I'm sorry, Mr. Peterson, but we cannot share security footage with passengers. It's against company policy." I slumped back in my chair, defeat washing over me, a cold wave of despair. They didn't believe me, or worse, what if they were in on it? What if this was all some elaborate cover-up? "Sir," Chief Thompson leaned forward, his voice now gentle, almost paternalistic. "Is it possible that what you thought you saw was a misunderstanding? Perhaps a rehearsal for one of the ship's theatrical productions? Or perhaps a vivid dream, fueled by the unfamiliar surroundings, the excitement of the cruise?" I wanted to argue, to insist, to scream that what I had witnessed was real, that a man had been brutally murdered just yards away from where I stood. But doubt, insidious and corrosive, had begun to creep in. Had I imagined it all? Was the stress of my job, the sudden, unfamiliar freedom of the vacation, playing tricks on my mind? I don't know anymore, I admitted, my voice small, defeated. Chief Thompson nodded sympathetically. It's not uncommon, Mr. Peterson, for passengers to experience vivid dreams or to misinterpret things they see, especially when they're in an unfamiliar environment. I can assure you, if there had been any evidence of foul play, we would have found it. Our security protocols are extremely thorough. I left the security office feeling dazed, confused, and profoundly unsettled. As I wandered aimlessly through the ship's brightly lit corridors, every laugh, every conversation, every shadow seemed to mock me, to whisper of secrets I couldn't comprehend. Had I truly imagined the whole thing? Was I losing my mind? The remaining days of the cruise passed in a surreal, unsettling haze. I went through the motions of enjoying my vacation, sunbathing, swimming, dining, but the joy, the carefree spirit had been extinguished. I couldn't shake the memory of what I had seen or thought I had seen that night. The image of the man collapsing to the floor, the chilling sound of his muffled cry, replayed in my mind with agonizing frequency. On the final night of the cruise, as I was packing my suitcase, preparing for disembarkation, there was a knock at my cabin door. My heart leaped into my throat, a surge of renewed fear washing over me. Had the killer finally come for me? Had they discovered my identity as a witness, despite my attempts at anonymity? With trembling hands, I cautiously opened the door. A ship's steward, a young man with a cheerful, unremarkable face, stood in the hallway, holding a small, sealed envelope. "Message for you, sir," he said, handing me the envelope with a polite smile before continuing on his rounds. I tore open the envelope, my hands still shaking. Inside was a single, folded sheet of paper. On it, a brief message was typed, in a simple, unadorned font. "Thank you for your discretion, Mr. Peterson. Enjoy the rest of your vacation. St." I stared at the note, my mind racing, struggling to decipher its meaning. S.T. Chief Thompson. Was this confirmation, proof that I hadn't imagined the whole thing, that a murder had taken place, and that the ship's security was involved in a cover-up? Or was it simply a polite, perfunctory thank you for not causing a panic among the other passengers, a way of dismissing me, of ensuring my silence? As the ship docked the following morning, and I joined the throng of passengers disembarking, I found myself scanning the faces around me, searching for any sign of recognition, any hint of menace. Was the killer among us, blending in with the excited, chattering tourists, heading home to resume their normal lives? Or had he slipped away at one of our port stops, vanishing into the Caribbean sunshine, leaving me with nothing but unanswered questions and a lingering sense of dread? I never received answers to those questions. In the years since that ill-fated cruise, I've replayed the events of that night countless times, turning them over and over in my mind, searching for clues, for explanations. Sometimes, I'm convinced it was all real, a brutal murder followed by an elaborate, meticulously orchestrated cover-up. Other times, I wonder if it was all a figment of my imagination, a product of stress, sleep deprivation, and an overactive imagination fueled by too many mystery novels. One thing, however, is undeniably certain. I never went on another cruise. The gentle rocking of a ship that once promised relaxation and escape now only evokes a sense of unease, of vulnerability, a chilling reminder of that night, of the thin line separating paradise from nightmare, and of how easily, how quickly one can become the other. To this day, whenever I see an advertisement for a luxury cruise, with its glossy images of sun-drenched decks, smiling passengers, and breathtaking sunsets, I can't help but think of moonlight on dark water, of raised voices behind a partially open door, of the sickening thud of a body hitting the floor. And I wonder about the secrets that might be hiding behind those carefully crafted images, the darkness that might be lurking just beneath the shimmering surface. Because sometimes, the most dangerous waters are the ones you're sailing through blissfully unaware, oblivious to the hidden currents, the unseen predators that lie in wait, Lake House legacy of lies. Family reunions, those carefully orchestrated gatherings, are supposed to be about reconnecting with loved ones, reminiscing about shared memories and creating new, joyful moments. No one ever warns you that they can also be about unearthing long-buried, deeply disturbing secrets and fighting for your very survival against those you thought you knew best. I learned this bitter lesson firsthand at our family's secluded lake house last summer, a gathering that shattered the illusion of familial harmony and exposed a darkness I never knew existed. It had been years, perhaps even a decade, since the entire extended family had been together in one place. Life, as it inevitably does, had scattered us across the country, pursuing different careers, different dreams, different lives. So, when Grandfather Theodore, the venerable patriarch of our clan, suggested we all convene at the old, cherished lake house in northern Minnesota for a week-long reunion, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to reconnect, to rekindle those familial bonds that had frayed over time. I arrived on a bright, sunny afternoon, the gravel driveway crunching pleasantly under the tires of my rental car as I pulled up to the sprawling, rustic wooden house. The lake, shimmering in the distance, its surface reflecting the clear blue sky, sparked a wave of nostalgic memories. The air was filled with the familiar, comforting scent of pine needles and damp earth. It was exactly as I remembered it from childhood summers spent swimming, fishing, and exploring the surrounding woods. Grandfather Theodore was the first to greet me, his weathered face, etched with the lines of time and experience, breaking into a wide, welcoming smile as he enveloped me in a bear hug, his embrace surprisingly strong for a man of his age. "Good to see you, Alex," he said, his voice gruff but warm, though I was well into my 30s and a seasoned investigative journalist. He still saw me as the inquisitive, adventurous child I once was. Over the next few hours, the rest of the family gradually trickled in: aunts, uncles, cousins, faces I hadn't seen in years, some I barely recognized. We all gathered in the large, open living room, with its panoramic views of the lake, catching up, reminiscing, sharing stories, the air filled with laughter and the excited chatter of reunited relatives. The atmosphere was, on the surface, jovial, festive, a picture-perfect image of familial harmony. But as the evening wore on, I couldn't shake a subtle, nagging feeling that something was amiss, that beneath the veneer of cheerful reunions, there were undercurrents of tension, of unspoken secrets. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. A quick, furtive glance exchanged between certain family members, a hushed conversation abruptly silenced as I approached. I noticed my Uncle Richard, in particular, seemed unusually on edge. He kept checking his phone, his brow furrowed with a persistent worry, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by a strained, forced cheerfulness. I tried to dismiss it, to attribute it to personal stress, perhaps work-related issues. But my journalist's instincts, honed over years of chasing stories, of uncovering hidden truths, were tingling, whispering that something wasn't quite right. As night descended, and most of the family retired to their respective rooms, I decided to seek some fresh air, a moment of solitude. The lake house boasted a beautiful, wraparound porch, perfect for stargazing and quiet contemplation. I was leaning against the railing, enjoying the cool night breeze and the mesmerizing expanse of the star-studded sky, when I heard voices hushed, urgent voices, coming from around the corner of the house. "I can't keep this up much longer, Father," Uncle Richard's voice, strained and laced with a desperate anger, said. "The creditors are breathing down my neck. I need that money. Now." "Patience, Richard," Grandfather Theodore's voice, usually so warm and reassuring, now held a hard, unyielding edge. "We'll sort this out, but not at the expense of the family's legacy." "Legacy?" Richard scoffed, his voice dripping with bitterness. "What good is a legacy if we're all bankrupt? If I lose everything?" I held my breath, my body frozen, not daring to move, to make a sound. What were they talking about? What money? What legacy? "The trust fund stays where it is," Grandfather Theodore said firmly, his voice unwavering. "It's for all of the grandchildren, Richard, not just to bail you out of your poor investments." There was a moment of tense, charged silence, broken only by the gentle lapping of the waves against the shore. Then, the sound of heavy footsteps stomping away, retreating into the depths of the house. I waited several minutes, my mind reeling, before quietly, cautiously making my way back to my room. The overheard conversation had opened a Pandora's box of questions, of suspicions. The next morning, I woke early, the remnants of a fitful sleep clinging to me. The overheard conversation from the previous night echoed in my mind, a persistent, unsettling refrain. As I made my way to the kitchen, drawn by the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, I passed by Grandfather Theodore's study. The door was ajar, and I could see him inside, hunched over his desk, poring over a stack of papers, his expression grim and deeply troubled. "Everything all right, Grandpa?" I asked, pushing the door open a little wider, my voice laced with a mixture of concern and carefully veiled curiosity. He looked up, startled, his eyes widening slightly before he quickly gathered the papers and shuffled them into a drawer. His movements hurried and almost furtive. "Of course, sweetheart," he replied, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just some boring old paperwork. Nothing for you to worry about." But I could see the worry, the deep-seated anxiety etched into the lines of his face, the way his hands trembled slightly as he closed the drawer. The facade of cheerful normalcy he was attempting to maintain was crumbling before my eyes. The day progressed with a series of carefully orchestrated family activities. Swimming in the lake, a boisterous barbecue lunch on the patio, board games and card games in the afternoon. But beneath the veneer of familial togetherness, I could sense the currents of tension, of unspoken secrets, swirling ever stronger. Uncle Richard remained sullen and withdrawn, barely participating in the festivities. Grandfather Theodore kept disappearing into his study for extended periods, emerging with an increasingly strained expression. And unable to sleep, my mind consumed by unanswered questions and growing suspicions, I decided to do some digging, to delve deeper into the secrets that seemed to be festering beneath the surface of our seemingly idyllic family reunion. I knew it was wrong, a violation of privacy, perhaps even a betrayal of trust. But my curiosity, my journalist's instinct to uncover the truth, and my genuine concern for my grandfather overrode any moral qualms I might have had. I crept down to the study, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpeting, using the flashlight on my phone to navigate the darkened hallway. The drawer Grandfather Theodore had so hastily closed earlier was locked. But years of picking locks for investigative stories, a skill I'd never imagined I'd utilize in my own family's home, proved unexpectedly useful. Inside the drawer, I found a treasure trove of information. Financial statements, legal documents, and a thick, worn folder labeled simply, "Trust Fund." As I carefully flipped through the papers, a disturbing picture began to emerge, a narrative of hidden wealth, reckless decisions, and desperate measures. The family's wealth, which I had always assumed came from Grandfather Theodore's successful business ventures, was, in fact, old money, inherited wealth dating back generations. It was tied up in a complex, meticulously structured trust fund designed to benefit all of the grandchildren, ensuring their financial security. Uncle Richard, it seemed, had made a series of disastrous investments, gambling away a significant portion of his own fortune. He was deeply in debt, facing financial ruin, and had been pressuring Grandfather Theodore to release the trust fund money prematurely, to bail him out of his self-inflicted predicament. But doing so would significantly diminish the inheritance of the other grandchildren, jeopardizing their future financial well-being. I was so engrossed in the documents, so absorbed in unraveling the tangled web of family secrets, that I didn't hear the footsteps approaching until it was too late. The study door creaked open, and I looked up, my heart leaping into my throat, to see Uncle Richard standing in the doorway, his face a mask of fury, his eyes blazing with anger. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he hissed, his voice low and menacing, advancing into the room, his presence filling the confined space. I scrambled to my feet, instinctively backing away, my mind racing. "Richard, I can explain," I stammered, but he wasn't interested in explanations. He was beyond reason, fueled by anger, desperation, and perhaps a touch of madness. In 2 quick strides, he was across the room, grabbing my arm in a vice-like grip, his fingers digging into my flesh. "You nosy little brat," he growled, his face inches from mine, his breath reeking of alcohol and desperation. "You have no idea what you're meddling in." I tried to pull away, to break free from his grasp, but he was too strong. "Let go of me, Richard," I cried out. "You're hurting me." "Oh, I'll do more than hurt you if you don't keep your mouth shut," he snarled, his grip tightening. "This is none of your damn business. Do you understand me?" Suddenly, another voice, strong and authoritative, cut through the tense, charged atmosphere. "Let her go, Richard." Grandfather Theodore stood in the doorway, his usually kind, gentle face now hard and unyielding, his eyes blazing with a righteous anger I had never seen before. Richard released me, stepping back, his expression shifting from rage to a mixture of shame and defiance. "Father, I can explain," he stammered. "Enough!" Grandfather Theodore's voice cracked like a whip, silencing Richard instantly. "I've had enough of your excuses, your threats, your greed. This ends. Now." What followed was a chaotic, emotionally charged confrontation that woke the entire household. Family members, roused from their sleep, rushed into the study, their faces a mixture of confusion, alarm, and dawning horror as the truth, long suppressed and carefully concealed, finally came spilling out. Uncle Richard's debts, his desperate attempts to access the trust fund money, even veiled threats he had made against Grandfather Theodore. It all came out in a torrent of accusations, recriminations, and tearful confessions. It was like a scene from a twisted, dysfunctional soap opera, except it was real, and it was happening to us, to our family. In the midst of the chaos, I slipped out onto the porch, my head spinning, my emotions in turmoil. How had a simple family reunion, a gathering meant to foster connection and celebrate shared history, devolved into this nightmare of secrets, lies, and betrayal? As dawn broke over the lake, casting a pale, ethereal light over the scene, the police arrived. Someone, I later learned it was Aunt Patricia, Richard's long-suffering wife, had called them, finally reaching her breaking point. Uncle Richard was taken away in handcuffs, shouting accusations and threats, his face contorted with rage and despair. The rest of us sat in stunned silence in the living room, the remnants of our shattered family reunion scattered around us like debris from a storm. Grandfather Theodore, his shoulders slumped with the weight of his burden, finally told us the whole story, the complete, unvarnished truth, the history of the trust fund, the family's hidden wealth, Richard's descent into debt and desperation. It was a tale of greed, betrayal, and the corrosive power of secrets. "I'm sorry," Grandfather Theodore said, his voice heavy with regret, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. "I thought I was protecting you all by keeping this a secret. I never imagined, I never dreamed it would come to this." In the days that followed, the carefully constructed facade of our family crumbled, revealing the fault lines and fissures that had long been hidden beneath the surface. The reunion, needless to say, was abruptly terminated. But as traumatic, as devastating as the experience had been, it also, paradoxically, brought us closer together, forging a new, albeit fragile, bond born of shared adversity. We really talked, for the first time in years, not the superficial, polite chit-chat of holiday gatherings, but honest, raw, sometimes painful conversations about the secrets, the resentments, the unspoken grievances that had festered for so long. We confronted the darkness that had lurked within our family, the toxic legacy of hidden wealth and unchecked ambition. Uncle Richard eventually pleaded guilty to charges of attempted extortion and financial malfeasance. Aunt Patricia, finally free from his controlling influence, filed for divorce. The trust fund was restructured, with greater transparency and safeguards put in place to prevent future abuses. As for me, I couldn't look at our family, at those cherished childhood memories of summers spent at the lake house, in the same way again. The rose-tinted glasses of nostalgia had been shattered, replaced by a more nuanced, more complex understanding of the people I loved, the flaws and vulnerabilities that lay beneath the surface. The lake house, once a symbol of carefree joy and familial unity, now stood as a stark reminder of how quickly things can change, how the people we think we know best can surprise us, for better or for worse. As I drove away at the end of that tumultuous, emotionally draining week, I glanced in my rearview mirror at the lake house, growing smaller and smaller in the distance. I realized that family isn't simply about shared blood, about happy memories and carefully curated holiday gatherings. It's about facing the hard truths together, about choosing to stand by each other, even when the carefully constructed facade of perfection crumbles, revealing the messy, complicated reality beneath. The next family reunion, we all agreed, would be held somewhere new, somewhere neutral, a fresh start, free from the weight of past secrets and lingering resentments. We needed to build a new foundation, a new legacy, based on honesty, transparency, and genuine connection. And as I merged onto the highway, heading back to my own life, my own world, I felt a complex mixture of sadness and hope. Our family had been shaken to its core, profoundly wounded by the events of that week. But we had survived, and perhaps, just perhaps, we would emerge stronger, more resilient, more authentically connected on the other side. The lake, with its shimmering surface and hidden depths, disappeared from view, and with it, the last vestiges of my childhood innocence. But ahead lay a future, uncertain yet hopeful, where our family, battle-scarred but unbowed, could forge a new path, a new understanding, a new definition of what it meant to be family. A family built not on secrets and lies, but on truth, forgiveness, and an enduring, if somewhat battered, love. The unseen watchers, they say that walls have ears. In that secluded, idyllic cabin in the woods, it wasn't the ears I needed to fear, but the eyes. Hidden cameras, strategically placed throughout the supposedly private retreat, transformed my peaceful getaway into a claustrophobic nightmare, a terrifying lesson in the pervasive erosion of privacy in the modern age. I learned, in the most visceral way possible, that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones you unwittingly invite into your life, the ones who watch you from the shadows, unseen and unknown. I'd been dreaming of this vacation for months, craving an escape from the relentless pressures of my demanding, high-stress job in the city. The idea of a week spent alone, in a cozy, rustic cabin, surrounded by nothing but towering trees and the soothing sounds of nature, seemed like the perfect antidote to my chronic anxiety and exhaustion. It was a promise of solitude, of tranquility, of a much-needed digital detox. When I stumbled upon the online listing for a secluded woodland retreat in the heart of the Adirondack Mountains, I didn't hesitate. I booked it immediately, my heart filled with anticipation. The photographs showed a charming, well-maintained log cabin, nestled deep within a pristine forest, seemingly miles from any other human habitation. It was exactly what I was looking for. The drive up was breathtaking, the road winding through increasingly dense forests, the air growing cooler and crisper with each passing mile. As I pulled up to the cabin, I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to ease, the accumulated stress of city life melting away. It was even more picturesque in person than it had appeared in the photos, a sturdy, inviting log structure with a wide, welcoming porch, smoke curling lazily from the chimney, a scene straight out of a rustic postcard. The owner, a friendly, avuncular older man named Silas, was waiting to greet me, his face creased with a warm, welcoming smile. "Welcome to your home away from home, Miss Evans," he said, handing me a set of keys. "Everything you need should be inside." If you require anything at all, don't hesitate to call. I'm just a phone call away. Enjoy your stay." I thanked him and watched as he drove away, leaving me alone in the profound, enveloping silence of the forest. It was a silence unlike anything I'd experienced in the city. Not the absence of sound, but rather a symphony of natural sounds, unmarred by the intrusive noises of human activity. No car horns, no sirens, no chattering crowds, just the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze, the occasional chirp of a bird, the distant murmur of a hidden stream. I inhaled deeply, savoring the clean, pine-scented air, feeling more relaxed, more at peace than I had in months. The interior of the cabin was just as charming and inviting as the exterior rustic wooden furniture. A large stone fireplace and expansive windows offering breathtaking views of the surrounding forest. I unpacked quickly, eager to settle in and begin my week of blissful solitude and relaxation. That first evening was pure, unadulterated bliss. I cooked a simple meal, opened a bottle of wine, and curled up in a comfortable armchair by the crackling fire, losing myself in the pages of a good book. As I drifted off to sleep that night, nestled in the cozy warmth of the cabin, I felt a sense of profound contentment, of utter peace. The next morning, I awoke early, refreshed and energized, eager to explore the surrounding wilderness. I spent hours hiking through the forest, marveling at the untouched beauty of the Adirondacks, the towering trees, the sparkling streams, the vibrant wildflowers. It was a sensory feast, a balm for my soul. When I returned to the cabin, pleasantly tired and hungry, that's when I first noticed it, a subtle, almost imperceptible feeling that something was off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, couldn't articulate exactly what was wrong, but the atmosphere of the cabin, the feeling of the space, seemed to have shifted subtly but distinctly. I shrugged it off, attributing it to my city-dweller paranoia, my ingrained habit of always being on guard. But as I moved around the cabin, preparing a late lunch, the feeling persisted, growing stronger, more insistent. It was as if the very air had become charged with an unseen presence, a silent, watchful energy. That's when I saw it. A tiny, almost invisible dark spot on the bookshelf, just above eye level. At first, I dismissed it as a knot in the wood, a natural imperfection in the grain. But as I looked closer, my blood ran cold. It was a camera lens, a miniature pinhole camera expertly concealed, almost impossible to detect unless you were specifically looking for it. My heart began to race, a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. I felt a wave of nausea, of violation, wash over me. I was being watched, with a growing sense of dread, of horrified realization. I began to search the cabin more thoroughly, more systematically. In the bedroom, I found another camera, cleverly hidden inside the smoke detector. The bathroom had one tucked discreetly into the ventilation grill. Even the kitchen wasn't safe. A tiny, malevolent lens peered out from inside the clock on the wall. Panic, raw and overwhelming, seized me. The reality of my situation, the full extent of my vulnerability, crashed down on me with the force of a physical blow. I was being spied upon, my every move, every moment of privacy, every intimate act, recorded, observed, perhaps even broadcast, by some unseen, unknown voyeur. My first instinct was to flee, to jump in my car and drive away as fast and as far as I could, to escape this terrifying, violated space. But as I looked out the window at the rapidly darkening sky, at the dense, impenetrable forest that surrounded the cabin, I realized I was trapped. I had no idea where I was truly. In my eagerness for a secluded getaway, I had paid little attention to the specific route we'd taken. My phone had no signal in this remote location, and I hadn't seen another house, another sign of human habitation, for miles. I was utterly, completely alone, at the mercy of whoever had planted those cameras. Taking a deep, shaky breath, I forced myself to think rationally, to formulate a plan, however desperate. Whoever had placed those hidden cameras clearly didn't want me to know about them. As long as I pretended everything was normal, As long as I maintained the illusion of blissful ignorance, I might be safe, at least temporarily. It bought me time to figure out my next move, to find a way to escape this terrifying situation. So, I went through the motions of my evening routine, acting as naturally as I could, despite the chilling awareness that I was being watched. Scrutinized, my every move recorded. I cooked dinner, ate in front of the fireplace, even pretended to read a book, all the while my mind racing, desperately searching for a solution. Was it Silas, the seemingly harmless, friendly owner? Or was it someone else, someone even more sinister, someone who had access to the cabin without his knowledge? That night was the longest, most agonizing of my life. I lay in bed, fully clothed, staring at the ceiling, jumping at every creak and groan of the old cabin, every rustle of leaves outside the window. Sleep was impossible. Every shadow seemed to conceal a threat, every sound a potential intruder. I felt like a trapped animal, exposed and vulnerable, my privacy utterly violated. As the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the windows, I made my decision. I had to get out. I couldn't stay in that cabin, in that prison of unseen eyes, a moment longer. I packed my bags as quickly and quietly as possible, trying to maintain the illusion of normalcy, in case someone was watching the live feed, monitoring my every move. Just as I was about to open the front door to make my escape, I heard the unmistakable crunch of tires on gravel outside. My heart leaped into my throat. Someone was here. Through the peephole in the door, I saw Silas's truck pulling up to the cabin. He stepped out, carrying a bag of groceries, that same friendly, avuncular smile on his face. But now, knowing what I knew, that smile seemed sinister, predatory, a mask concealing a dark and disturbing secret. I opened the door, forcing a smile of my own, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. "Silas?" I said, my voice surprisingly steady, despite the tremor in my hands. "What a surprise." "Morning, Miss Evans," he replied cheerfully, his voice booming in the stillness of the morning. "Thought I'd bring you some fresh supplies. How are you enjoying your stay?" The casual tone, the utter normalcy of his demeanor, made my skin crawl. Did he know that I knew? Was this all part of some sick, twisted game? Was he toying with me? "It's been great," I lied, my voice tight with suppressed fear and anger. "But actually, I just got a call from work. An emergency. I have to head back to the city immediately." Silas's smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second. A flicker of something, disappointment, anger, crossing his face. "Oh, that's a shame," he said, his voice losing some of its cheerful lilt. "Are you sure you can't stay? The weather report says there's a storm coming in later today. Might not be safe to drive." The veiled threat was unmistakable. He didn't want me to leave. He wanted me to stay trapped in his web of surveillance. "I'm sure," I said firmly, gesturing towards my packed bags. "Thanks for everything, Silas, but I really must go." For a long, tense moment, we stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills. I was acutely aware of how isolated we were, how easily things could turn violent. My car keys felt heavy in my pocket, a tangible symbol of my only means of escape. Finally, Silas's smile returned, but it was a cold, forced smile, devoid of any genuine warmth. It didn't reach his eyes. "Well, if you must," he said, stepping aside. "Drive safely." I nodded, skirting around him, moving as quickly as I could towards my car, every nerve on high alert. I felt his eyes on me, watching my every move, and I half expected him to lunge at me, to try to stop me. But somehow, miraculously, I made it to the car, unlocked the door, and threw my bags inside. As I pulled away, I saw Silas standing on the porch in my rearview mirror, watching me go, his expression unreadable. I didn't breathe easily until the cabin disappeared from view, swallowed by the dense forest. Once I reached the main road, I drove straight to the nearest police station, my hands still shaking, my mind reeling from the ordeal. The officers, initially skeptical, hidden cameras, a creepy cabin owner. It sounded like the plot of a B-movie. Gradually became more convinced as they listened to my story, as they saw the raw, genuine terror in my eyes. They launched an investigation, and what they found chilled me to the bone. Not only were there hidden cameras throughout the cabin, as I had discovered, but there was also a secret, concealed room, accessible only through a hidden panel in the basement. Inside, they found a sophisticated surveillance setup, monitors displaying live feeds from the cameras, recording equipment, and hard drives filled with footage of previous guests, unsuspecting victims of Silas's twisted voyeurism. Silas, it turned out, had been running this horrific scheme for years, preying on unsuspecting tourists, selling the footage on the darkest corners of the internet, profiting from the violation of their privacy. The investigation uncovered a network of similar operations, stretching across multiple states, a vast underground web of voyeurism and exploitation. My discovery, my desperate flight, had blown the lid off a massive criminal enterprise. In the months that followed, as the case made its way through the legal system, attracting national media attention, I struggled to regain a sense of normalcy, to rebuild my shattered sense of trust and security. I jumped at unexpected noises, flinched at sudden movements, and felt a constant, nagging sense of unease of being watched, even in my own home. Therapy helped, providing me with coping mechanisms and strategies to manage my anxiety and post-traumatic stress. The support of friends and family was invaluable, a lifeline in a sea of fear and uncertainty. But the experience had fundamentally changed me, altering my perception of the world, of the people in it. I couldn't look at hotel rooms, vacation rentals, or even my own apartment in the same way anymore. I was always searching, always scanning for hidden cameras, for any sign of surveillance. The feeling of being watched, of having my privacy violated, lingered, a persistent shadow that followed me everywhere. It took time, a considerable amount of time, but slowly, gradually, I began to reclaim my life, to rebuild my sense of safety and trust. I learned to channel my fear, my anger, into something positive, something productive. I became an advocate for privacy rights, sharing my story with others, warning them about the potential dangers of hidden cameras and the importance of being vigilant, of trusting their instincts. I didn't swear off vacations or even secluded cabins entirely. The thought of letting fear dictate my life, of allowing Silas and his ilk to rob me of my joy, my love of nature, was almost as terrifying as the experience itself. But I approach these situations differently now, with a heightened awareness, a cautious skepticism that I had never possessed before. I researched locations thoroughly, reading reviews carefully, looking for any red flags. I always let someone know where I was going and when I expected to return, and I carried a small, handheld device, a bug detector, that could identify hidden cameras and recording equipment, a tangible symbol of my newfound vigilance, my determination to protect myself. The experience had left its mark, an indelible scar on my psyche, but it had also taught me resilience, the power of survival, and the importance of fighting back. I had faced one of my worst fears, the utter violation of my privacy, and I had emerged, not unscathed, but stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to live my life on my own terms. I learned that the world is full of hidden eyes, of unseen watchers, lurking in the shadows, waiting to exploit our vulnerabilities. But I also learned that my eyes were open now, that I possessed the knowledge and the tools to protect myself, to navigate this increasingly surveilled world with a newfound sense of awareness and agency. As I sit here now, writing this story, sharing my experience with the world, I can't help but glance around the room, checking for that telltale glint of a hidden lens, that subtle indication of unseen surveillance. It's a habit I'll likely never break, a reflex born of trauma and a deep-seated need for self-preservation. But I'm no longer paralyzed by fear. Instead, I'm driven by a sense of purpose, a determination to live fully and freely, to not let the darkness win. Because in the end, the most important eyes watching me are my own. And what they see is a survivor, a fighter, a woman who has faced her demons and emerged stronger, wiser. and more determined than ever to protect herself and others from the hidden horrors that can lurk in even the most idyllic, seemingly safe retreats. The peaceful cabin in the woods, once a symbol of escape and tranquility, had become a stark reminder of the pervasive threats to privacy in the modern world. But it had also become a symbol of my own resilience, my own refusal to be a victim. The asphalt asylum, the open road, a quintessential symbol of American freedom, has always held a powerful allure, promising adventure, escape, and the chance to discover oneself amidst the ever-changing landscapes. But I learned, in the most terrifying way imaginable, that the open road can also become a prison, a seemingly endless asphalt labyrinth where every mile brings you closer to an unknown, pursuing threat, a relentless force that refuses to let you go. I'd always harbored a deep-seated yearning to embark on a classic cross-country road trip, to traverse the vast expanse of America, from the bustling cities of the East Coast to the sun-drenched shores of the Pacific. The idea of driving for days, weeks, even witnessing the gradual transformation of the landscape, experiencing the diverse cultures and communities that make up this sprawling nation, had captivated my imagination since childhood. So, when I finally found myself with both the time and the resources to make this long-held dream a reality, I didn't hesitate. I meticulously packed my trusty, if somewhat aging Honda Civic, crafted a loose, flexible itinerary that allowed for spontaneous detours and unexpected discoveries, and set off from my home in Boston, heading west, my heart filled with a mixture of excitement and anticipation. The first few days of the journey were everything I had hoped for, and more. I explored charming New England towns, steeped in history and brimming with quaint beauty. I stopped at roadside diners, indulging in hearty breakfasts and engaging in conversations with friendly locals, each encounter a glimpse into a different way of life. I marveled at the gradual, yet dramatic, shift in the scenery as I crossed into the vast, open plains of the Midwest. The feeling of freedom, of limitless possibility was intoxicating. It was in a small, nondescript town in Nebraska, roughly a week into my journey, that the tone of my adventure began to shift, subtly at first, then with increasing, alarming speed. I had stopped for gas at a somewhat dilapidated station on the outskirts of town. As I was filling my tank, I noticed a group of men lounging near a beat-up, rust-covered pickup truck, watching me with an unnerving intensity. Their gaze, their posture, the way they seemed to be silently communicating with each other, sent a shiver of apprehension down my spine. But I dismissed it, attributing it to the natural curiosity, perhaps even suspicion, of small-town residents towards an unfamiliar face, an out-of-state license plate. I went inside the station to pay for my gas and grab a few snacks for the road. When I emerged, the men were gone. But as I walked back to my car, I could have sworn I saw their truck pulling out of the station, heading in the same direction I was. I shook off my growing sense of unease, telling myself I was being paranoid, that it was just a coincidence. I cranked up the radio, singing along to my favorite tunes, trying to distract myself from the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't until about an hour later, as I continued westward on the seemingly endless highway, that I noticed the truck again. It was far behind me, a distant speck in my rearview mirror, but I recognized the distinctive rust pattern on its hood, the dented rear bumper. My heart rate increased, a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. But again, I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was just a coincidence. After all, there was only one major highway cutting through this sparsely populated part of the state. It made sense that we would be traveling in the same direction. However, as the miles relentlessly ticked by, the truck remained a constant, unwavering presence in my rearview mirror. Sometimes it would disappear for extended periods, seemingly vanishing into thin air, only to reappear later, always maintaining a safe distance, but never quite allowing me to escape its watchful presence. It was like a game of cat and mouse, and I was increasingly feeling like the prey. By the time the sun began to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the vast, empty plains, I was in a state of full-blown panic. I considered pulling over in the next town, perhaps seeking assistance from the local police. But a nagging voice in my head, a growing sense of dread and distrust, warned me that stopping could be even more dangerous. What if these men were locals? What if they had connections within the community, within law enforcement? In my increasingly agitated, paranoid state, every small town seemed like a potential trap, a potential dead end. So, I kept driving, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel, my eyes constantly flicking between the road ahead and the rearview mirror, my heart pounding in my chest like a frantic drum. The vast, open landscape, which had seemed so liberating, so exhilarating just hours before, now felt oppressive, menacing, a suffocating expanse with nowhere to hide, nowhere to escape the relentless scrutiny of my pursuers. As night descended, cloaking the world in darkness, I made a desperate, impulsive decision. At the next junction, instead of continuing westward on the main highway, as I had originally planned, I abruptly turned south onto a smaller, less traveled road. It was a gamble, a desperate attempt to throw off whoever was following me, to break free from their relentless pursuit. For a blissful, fleeting half hour, I saw no sign of the truck. The road ahead was empty, the darkness complete. I began to relax, to breathe a little easier, thinking perhaps, just perhaps, I had imagined the whole thing, that my anxiety and exhaustion had gotten the better of me. Then, at the crest of a low hill, I saw them headlights in the distance, approaching rapidly, their beams cutting through the darkness like predatory eyes. My blood ran cold. Somehow, impossibly, they had found me again. I pressed down hard on the accelerator, pushing my aging Honda Civic to its absolute limits, the engine whining in protest. The speedometer needle climbed steadily, 80, 85, 90 miles per hour, but the headlights in my rearview mirror continued to gain ground, their relentless approach fueling my mounting terror. My car, designed for fuel efficiency and city commuting, wasn't built for this kind of high-speed chase, and every bump, every pothole, every imperfection in the road surface felt like it might send me careening off into the darkness, ending my desperate flight in a fiery crash. Suddenly, a new set of headlights appeared ahead of me, blindingly bright, illuminating the narrow road with an almost surreal intensity. Another truck, similar in appearance to the one pursuing me, was barreling towards me, head-on. I realized, with a surge of pure, unadulterated horror, that they were attempting to box me in, to force me to stop, to trap me between them. With mere seconds to react, with no time for considered thought or strategic planning, I did the only thing I could think of, a desperate maneuver born of pure instinct. I yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, sending my car careening off the paved road and onto a narrow, barely discernible dirt track I hadn't even noticed in the darkness. The car bounced violently, the suspension screaming in protest, and for a terrifying, heart-stopping moment, I thought I would lose control completely, that I would flip, that it would all be over. But somehow, miraculously, I managed to keep the vehicle upright, to maintain some semblance of control, as I plunged deeper and deeper into the unknown, uncharted terrain. I killed my headlights, relying solely on the faint, ethereal glow of the moon to guide me, a desperate gamble to evade my pursuers, to disappear into the darkness. Behind me, I could hear the roar of engines, the angry shouts of the men, as the trucks attempted to follow. But their larger, less maneuverable vehicles struggled on the rough, uneven ground, their progress hampered by the challenging terrain. Slowly, gradually, the sounds of pursuit began to fade, receding into the distance. I drove for what felt like an eternity, though in reality, it was probably only a matter of minutes. Every bump, every jolt, every rustle of vegetation against the sides of the car sent a fresh spike of fear through me. The constant threat of crashing, of being stranded, of being caught, looming large in my mind. But somehow, against all odds, I kept going, driven by a primal, unwavering will to survive. Finally, when I could no longer hear any sign of my pursuers, when the only sounds were the frantic beating of my own heart, the chirping of crickets, and the distant howl of a coyote, I allowed myself to slow down, to bring the car to a shuddering halt. I was completely, utterly lost, surrounded by what appeared to be vast, empty farmland, with no idea which direction would lead me back to civilization, back to safety. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely grip the steering wheel, and my body was drenched in a cold sweat. I pulled over to the side of the dirt track, in the shadow of what looked like an abandoned barn, a crumbling relic of a bygone era. I killed the engine, plunging myself into near-total darkness, and sat there, in the oppressive silence of the night, straining my ears for any sound, any indication of approaching vehicles. But there was nothing, only the sounds of the rural night, the chirping of crickets, the distant mooing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the tall, dry grass. The silence was both a relief and a source of profound unease. As the adrenaline that had fueled my desperate, high-speed flight began to slowly dissipate, the full weight of my predicament, the sheer precariousness of my situation, crashed down on me with overwhelming force. I was alone, stranded in the middle of nowhere, miles from any known landmark or town, being hunted by unknown assailants for reasons I couldn't begin to fathom. My mind raced, a chaotic whirlwind of questions, fears, and desperate calculations. Who were these people? What did they want from me? How had they managed to follow me for so long, across such vast distances, without me even realizing I was being pursued? Had I unknowingly witnessed something I shouldn't have at that first seemingly innocuous gas station? Had I inadvertently offended them in some way? Or was this something far more sinister, something random and inexplicable, a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time? I checked my phone, hoping against hope for a signal, a connection to the outside world, a lifeline to sanity and safety. But there was nothing, no bars, no service. I was utterly, completely alone, cut off from any assistance. My only companion, the gnawing fear that consumed me, as the first pale light of dawn began to creep across the horizon, painting the eastern sky in soft hues of gray, pink, and orange. I made a decision. I couldn't remain where I was, a sitting duck, vulnerable and exposed, and I couldn't go back the way I had come. Retracing my route would almost certainly lead me back into the path of my pursuers. My only option, however slim, however fraught with uncertainty, was to push forward, to try to find my way back to civilization, to find help, to survive. I started the car, wincing at how loud the engine sounded in the pre-dawn quiet, the sound a potential beacon, advertising my presence to anyone who might be listening. I chose a direction almost at random, guided by a faint sense of hope and the position of the rising sun, praying that it would lead me to a main road, a town, a gas station, anything that offered a semblance of safety and the possibility of contacting the authorities. After about an hour of slow, cautious driving, navigating the network of narrow, unpaved country lanes, meticulously avoiding the main highways where I feared my pursuers might be lying in wait, I finally, blessedly, saw signs of human habitation. A small town, its buildings silhouetted against the brightening sky, appeared on the horizon, a glimmer of hope in the vast, seemingly endless emptiness. But as I approached, that glimmer of hope was quickly, cruelly extinguished, replaced by a renewed surge of fear, a cold wave of dread washing over me. There, parked prominently in front of the town's only gas station, a mirror image of the scene that had initiated this nightmare, was the rust-covered pickup truck, the vehicle that had haunted my rearview mirror, the symbol of my relentless pursuers. I didn't slow down. I didn't even consider stopping. I sped through the town as fast as I dared, my heart pounding in my chest, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, praying that no one would recognize my car, that no one would give chase. In my mirror, I saw a figure emerge from the gas station, pointing in my direction, his shout lost in the distance. Moments later, the truck's engine roared to life, and the chase, the terrifying pursuit, began anew. I pushed my aging Civic to its absolute limits, taking turns at dangerous speeds, the tires squealing in protest, the car rattling and shaking as if it might fall apart at any moment. I weaved through the quiet streets of the town, desperately seeking an escape route, a way to outmaneuver my pursuers. But they seemed to know the area intimately, anticipating my every move, always managing to stay on my tail, their presence a constant, menacing threat. It wasn't until I crossed the state line, leaving Nebraska behind and entering the more mountainous terrain of Colorado, that I finally, miraculously, managed to shake them. The winding mountain roads, with their steep inclines and hairpin turns, provided cover, and the smaller size and greater maneuverability of my car finally gave me a decisive advantage. I navigated the treacherous curves with a reckless abandon born of desperation, pushing my vehicle and myself to the very edge of our capabilities. By the time I reached Denver, hours later, I was a physical and emotional wreck, exhausted, terrified, and completely, utterly paranoid. I drove straight to the nearest police station, my hands still trembling, my body aching, my mind reeling from the ordeal. But my story, recounted in a shaky, adrenaline-fueled rush, sounded improbable, almost fantastical, even to my own ears. A mysterious group of men, chasing me relentlessly across multiple states, for no apparent reason. The officers were, understandably, skeptical, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and polite condescension. They took my statement, promised to investigate, but I could sense their doubt, their unspoken assumption that I was exaggerating, that I was perhaps mentally unstable, or that I had misinterpreted some innocent encounter. I couldn't blame them, really. If someone had told me this story a week ago, before my life had taken this terrifying, surreal turn, I wouldn't have believed it either. The rational part of my mind struggled to make sense of it all. In the end, I abandoned my meticulously planned road trip, my dreams of exploring the country shattered, replaced by a deep-seated fear and a profound sense of vulnerability. I sold my beloved Honda Civic, the car that had been my faithful companion and my only means of escape, a painful but necessary decision. The vehicle felt tainted, a constant, visceral reminder of my ordeal. I bought a plane ticket and flew back home to Boston, constantly looking over my shoulder in the crowded airport, half expecting to see those menacing men appear at any moment, their faces a haunting presence in my nightmares. Back in the familiar, relatively safe environment of my city life, I tried to resume my normal routine to put the terrifying experience behind me. But something fundamental had shifted within me. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, of being constantly pursued. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, always scanning for potential threats, always planning escape routes, my mind a whirlwind of what-ifs and worst-case scenarios. Crowds made me anxious, and I found myself flinching at sudden noises, my body reacting instinctively to any perceived danger. Months passed, and slowly, gradually, the acute, paralyzing fear began to subside, replaced by a lingering unease, a chronic sense of vulnerability. But the experience had left its mark, an indelible scar on my psyche. I never discovered the identities of those men, or unraveled the mystery of their relentless pursuit. Perhaps it was a case of mistaken identity, a cruel and terrifying coincidence. Or maybe I had unknowingly witnessed something I shouldn't have at that first fateful gas station, some illicit transaction, some clandestine meeting that I had inadvertently stumbled upon. The possibilities, the unanswered questions, haunted me. I'll probably never know the truth, the full explanation for that harrowing cross-country chase. What I do know is that the open road, once a symbol of freedom, of adventure, of limitless possibility, now fills me with a profound sense of unease, of vulnerability, of dread. The vast expanse of America, which I had so longed to explore, to experience, now seems like a dangerous, unpredictable place, where anyone at any time can become a target, a victim of forces they can't see, can't understand, and can't control. I still travel, occasionally, but never by car, never alone, and never without a meticulously planned itinerary, shared with trusted friends and family. The spontaneous, carefree road trip of my dreams has become a recurring nightmare, a source of persistent anxiety. And every time I see a rusty pickup truck in my rearview mirror, even in the familiar streets of my own city, my heart skips a beat, my palms begin to sweat, and for a fleeting, terrifying moment, I'm back on that dark, desolate highway, running for my life from an enemy I can't see, can't understand, and can't escape. The road may go on forever, stretching out towards the horizon, beckoning with the promise of adventure. But for me, that particular journey, that cross-country odyssey, is irrevocably over. Some adventures, I've learned the hard way, are best left to the realm of imagination, safely confined to the pages of books or the flickering images on a screen. The real world, the open road, can be far more dangerous, far more unpredictable than any fictional narrative. And sometimes the greatest freedom lies not in chasing the horizon, but in finding safety, in finding peace within the confines of a world that feels, if not entirely secure, at least knowable. The scars of that experience remain, a constant reminder of the fragility of life, the ever-present potential for darkness, and the enduring power of fear. But they are also a reminder of my own resilience, my own ability to survive, to adapt, and to find a new path, a new way forward, even in the face of unimaginable terror. Appalachian apparitions. The Appalachian Trail, a legendary footpath winding its way through the heart of the eastern United States, is renowned for its breathtaking scenery, its challenging terrain, and its promise of solitude and self-discovery. I sought that solitude, that escape from the relentless pressures of modern life. But what I found, deep within the shadowed forests and mist-shrouded mountains, was not peace, but terror, a desperate struggle for survival against a threat far more real and far more dangerous than any mythical creature of folklore. I've always been drawn to the wilderness, to the untamed beauty and profound silence of nature. There's a certain solace, a restorative power, in disconnecting from the digital world, from the constant demands of modern life, and immersing oneself in the rhythms of the natural world. So, when I found myself with an unexpected week of free time, a rare and precious commodity in my fast-paced, demanding career, I didn't hesitate. I packed my well-worn backpack, loaded my camping gear into my trusty, if somewhat battered, camper van, and set off for the Appalachian Mountains, seeking respite and renewal. My plan was simple: to find a remote, secluded spot, far from the well-trodden trails and crowded campsites, and simply be, to reconnect with myself, to find a sense of peace and clarity amidst the chaos of my everyday existence. I had a vague destination in mind, a remote area I'd read about online, a place described as being off the beaten path and untouched by civilization. Sounded perfect. The drive itself was a journey of transformation. As I left the bustling city behind, the landscape gradually shifting from concrete and steel to rolling hills and verdant forests, I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to ease, the weight of my responsibilities lifting with each passing mile. The roads grew narrower, more winding, the air cleaner and crisper. I turned onto an unmarked dirt road, leaving the last vestiges of civilization. A small, unassuming general store and a cluster of weathered houses in my rearview mirror. The road became progressively rougher, more challenging, my van bouncing and swaying over rocks, ruts, and fallen branches. But I pressed on, determined to reach my destination, to find that secluded sanctuary I had envisioned. As the sun began to set, casting long, dramatic shadows through the towering trees, I finally found it. A small, almost perfectly level clearing, nestled beside a clear, fast-flowing stream, surrounded by a dense canopy of ancient pines and hardwoods. It was idyllic, a scene of pristine beauty and utter tranquility. I set up camp quickly, efficiently, the familiar routine a comforting ritual. As darkness descended, I built a small campfire, its flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. I sat beside the fire, listening to the symphony of the night, the gentle murmur of the stream, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, the occasional hoot of an owl, feeling a sense of profound peace, of connection with the natural world, that I hadn't experienced in years. I drifted off to sleep that night, cocooned in my sleeping bag inside my van, feeling safe, secure, and utterly at peace. The next morning, I awoke early, refreshed and invigorated, eager to explore the surrounding wilderness. I spent the day hiking, following faint, unmarked trails, marveling at the breathtaking views from rocky outcrops, the unspoiled beauty of the Appalachian landscape unfolding before me. It was a day of solitary exploration, of quiet contemplation, of deep connection with nature. By late afternoon, pleasantly tired and deeply satisfied, I began to make my way back to my campsite, my mind filled with images of the day's discoveries. That's when things began to go horribly, terrifyingly wrong. As I approached my van, I noticed something immediately amiss. The door was slightly ajar, hanging open at an unnatural angle, and I was absolutely certain I had locked it securely. A jolt of adrenaline, a surge of primal fear, coursed through me. My heart rate accelerated, my senses on high alert. Had an animal somehow managed to get inside? A bear, perhaps, drawn by the scent of food? Or worse, had another person been there? I cautiously approached, my hand instinctively reaching for the small can of pepper spray I carried in my backpack. I peered inside, and my blood ran cold. The interior of my van had been ransacked, completely and utterly trashed. My belongings were strewn about haphazardly, ripped open, their contents scattered across the floor, and several items were conspicuously missing: my phone, my wallet, my car keys. Before I could fully process the implications of this discovery, before I could even begin to formulate a plan, I heard voices in the distance. Gruff, angry voices, growing steadily closer. I instinctively ducked down behind the van, concealing myself from view, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath catching in my throat. "I'm tellin' ya, I saw smoke from a campfire round here yesterday." One voice growled, thick with a heavy Appalachian drawl. "Gotta be one of them city folks trespassing on our land. Well, they picked the wrong damn mountain to mess with." Another voice replied, laced with a chilling menace. "Let's show 'em what happens to folks who don't respect private property." Private property. My mind reeled, but this was public land, wasn't it? I'd researched it thoroughly, or so I thought. I was certain I was within the boundaries of a national forest, where camping was permitted. But as the voices drew nearer, I realized that my certainty, my meticulous research, my legal rights, mattered little in this moment. These men believed I was trespassing, and they sounded anything but reasonable, anything but willing to engage in a polite discussion. I had mere seconds to make a decision, to act. My van was useless without the keys, a metal cage that offered no protection. I had no way to call for help, no way to contact the outside world. My only option, my only hope, was to flee, to escape into the dense forest and pray I could lose them in the labyrinthine wilderness. I grabbed my day pack, thankful that I had at least left it outside the van, a small, almost insignificant stroke of luck in this rapidly escalating nightmare. It contained a few essential items: a half-empty water bottle, a couple of protein bars, a small first aid kit, a lighter, and a multi-tool. Not much, but it would have to do. And then I ran. I took off into the woods, moving as quietly and swiftly as I could, crashing through the undergrowth, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum, my lungs burning with exertion. Behind me, I heard shouts of discovery as they found my ransacked campsite, their angry voices echoing through the trees, spurring me on, fueling my desperate flight. "Hey, there's someone here," one of them yelled. "Find Jing. Don't let em get away." The sound of heavy footsteps, crashing through the underbrush, pursuing me was terrifying. I didn't dare look back, didn't dare slow down, focusing all my energy, all my will, on putting as much distance as possible between myself and my pursuers. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful, so welcoming just hours before, now felt menacing, hostile. Branches whipped at my face, leaving stinging welts. Thorns tore at my clothes, snagging on my skin. Roots hidden beneath the thick carpet of fallen leaves, threatened to trip me at every step. But I pressed on, driven by pure, unadulterated fear, by the primal instinct to survive. I had no idea where I was going, no sense of direction. The dense canopy of trees obscured the sky, making it impossible to navigate by the sun. The forest floor was a confusing maze of vegetation, fallen logs and rocky outcrops, but I kept moving, blindly, desperately, hoping against hope that I could somehow outmaneuver my pursuers. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in that desperate, adrenaline-fueled flight. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, each second an eternity. But eventually, gradually, the sounds of pursuit began to fade, receding into the distance. I allowed myself to slow down, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest, my body trembling with exhaustion. I collapsed behind a large, fallen tree, its decaying trunk offering a semblance of cover, a temporary refuge. I tried to catch my breath, to regain some semblance of composure, while still listening intently for any sign of my pursuers. Nothing, only the sound of my own ragged breathing, the frantic beating of my heart, and the natural, almost mocking, sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, the gentle murmur of the nearby stream. As the adrenaline began to slowly recede, the full weight of my situation, the sheer precariousness of my predicament, crashed down on me with overwhelming force. I was lost, alone, in the heart of the Appalachian wilderness, with no phone, no car, and minimal supplies. And somewhere out there, armed, hostile men were actively hunting for me. I took stock of my meager resources, assessing what I had to work with. The half-empty water bottle was my most pressing concern. Dehydration, in this environment, could be deadly. I rationed the remaining water carefully, taking small, infrequent sips, knowing I had to make it last as long as possible. As night fell, the temperature plummeted. The forest, already menacing, became even more so in the darkness. Every shadow seemed to conceal a threat, every sound amplified by my fear and exhaustion. I was afraid to start a fire, knowing that the smoke, the light, would be a beacon, attracting my pursuers. Instead, I huddled in the hollow of a large, ancient tree, shivering uncontrollably, trying to conserve body heat. Sleep was impossible. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves, every distant animal call sent a jolt of fear through me, my senses on high alert, expecting to see the menacing figures of those men emerge from the darkness at any moment. The night stretched on, an endless, agonizing expanse of time punctuated by fear, uncertainty, and the gnawing pangs of hunger and thirst. When dawn finally broke, painting the eastern sky in pale shades of gray and pink, I was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but alive. I knew I couldn't stay where I was. I had to keep moving to try to find my way back to civilization, to find help. But I had no idea which direction to go. I remembered a piece of advice I'd read long ago in some survival manual. Following a stream downhill often leads to larger bodies of water and eventually to human settlements. So, when I stumbled upon a small, fast-flowing creek, I decided to follow it, clinging to that faint glimmer of hope. The going was tough, arduous. The terrain was steep and rocky, the stream bed treacherous and uneven. I had to scramble over fallen logs, wade through icy cold water, and constantly fight my way through dense undergrowth. I stopped frequently to rest, my exhausted body screaming in protest, but the fear of being found, the primal instinct to survive, kept me moving, kept me pushing forward. It was nearing sunset, the second day of my desperate flight, when I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of voices. This time, I was certain it wasn't my imagination, wasn't a phantom sound born of fear and exhaustion. They were closer now, and there were more of them. I saw something move down by the creek, a voice shouted, rough and menacing. Spread out, another voice commanded. Don't let 'em get away. They ain't getting off this mountain without us finned in. Panic surged through me. a cold wave of dread washing over my body. They were too close. I couldn't outrun them, not in this terrain, not in my weakened, exhausted state. I needed to hide, to find a place where I could conceal myself, a place where they wouldn't find me. Desperate, my eyes scanned the surrounding landscape, searching for any possible refuge. That's when I spotted it, a small, dark opening in the rocky hillside, partially obscured by dense vegetation. A cave, or perhaps just a deep crevice, a narrow fissure in the rock face. It was my only hope. Without hesitation, I scrambled towards the opening, squeezing myself through the narrow gap, my heart pounding in my chest. The space was tight, cramped, and pitch black. I could barely move, barely breathe, but I was hidden. I held my breath, listening intently, my body rigid with tension, as I heard the footsteps approaching, drawing closer and closer. "You sure you saw something?" one voice asked, so close I could almost feel his breath. "I'm telling ya, there was movement," another replied, his voice laced with frustration and a hint of doubt. Crafty son of a must-have found a hide-in place. They searched for what felt like an eternity, their voices and movements a constant, terrifying presence just outside my cramped, claustrophobic refuge. I remained frozen, hardly daring to breathe, my muscles cramping, my throat burning with thirst, but I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. Finally, as the last rays of sunlight faded and darkness enveloped the forest, I heard them moving away, their voices receding into the distance. "It's getting too dark," one of them said. "We'll pick up the search tomorrow. Ain't no way they're getting off this mountain without us knowing." I waited, listening intently, until I was absolutely certain they were gone, until the only sounds were the natural, nocturnal noises of the forest. Then, slowly, carefully, I crawled out of my hiding place, my body stiff and aching, my mind reeling from the near constant terror. I knew I couldn't stay there. They would be back at first light, and I needed to be far away as far as possible. So, I started moving again, stumbling through the darkness, feeling my way along the rocky terrain, guided only by the faint, pale light of the moon and the distant glimmer of stars. It was slow, agonizing progress fraught with danger. I constantly feared making a noise, tripping, falling, giving away my position. But as the night wore on, I began to see lights in the distance, faint, flickering lights, but unmistakable signs of human habitation. Hope, a surge of renewed energy, coursed through me. I pushed on, drawn to those distant lights like a moth to a flame, my pace quickening despite my exhaustion. As dawn broke, I stumbled onto a paved road, a sign of civilization, a lifeline to safety. An hour later, a car, driven by a startled, early morning commuter, picked me up, a disheveled, wild-eyed figure emerging from the wilderness. He took me to the nearest police station, his expression a mixture of concern and disbelief as I recounted my harrowing tale. The authorities were initially skeptical of my story. A lone female hiker, claiming to have been chased through the mountains by armed men, sounded far-fetched, like something out of a movie. But when they ran the license plates on my abandoned van and discovered it was parked on land that had been privately owned for years, things began to fall into place. It turned out the public land I had so confidently researched online was outdated information. The area had been sold to a reclusive, notoriously territorial family years ago, a family known for their hostility towards outsiders, their fierce protection of their property, and their disregard for the law. In the end, I was lucky. I got off with a warning for trespassing, a minor infraction compared to the ordeal I had endured. The police recovered my van and my belongings, though the experience had irrevocably tainted them, transforming them from symbols of freedom and adventure into reminders of terror and vulnerability. But the experience left me shaken to my core, my sense of safety, my trust in the world, profoundly damaged. I still love nature, still feel the undeniable pull of the wilderness, the yearning for solitude and connection with the natural world. But I now approach it with a newfound respect, a heightened awareness of the potential dangers that can lurk even in the most beautiful, seemingly serene landscapes. I double, triple, and quadruple check my information before venturing into unfamiliar territory. I always let someone know my precise plans, my intended route, and my expected return time. And I never, ever venture into the wilderness alone. The mountains still call to me. Their majestic beauty still beckons. But now I hear a warning in their whispers, a chilling reminder of the fragility of life, the precariousness of safety, and the darkness that can reside within the human heart. The line between adventure and nightmare, I learned, is razor thin, and it's all too easy to find yourself on the wrong side of it, fighting for your survival against forces you can't control, can't comprehend. The memory of those terrifying days and nights in the Appalachians, the feeling of being hunted, of being utterly alone and vulnerable, will likely stay with me forever. But it has also instilled in me a deeper appreciation for the kindness of strangers, for the resilience of the human spirit, and for the importance of trusting my instincts, of heeding those inner warnings that whisper of danger. The freedom of the wilderness is a precious gift, but it's a gift that must be approached with respect, with caution, and with a profound awareness that sometimes the greatest threats we face aren't the wild animals or the unforgiving elements, but the darkness that can reside within our fellow human beings. And in those remote, isolated places, where the law feels distant and personal justice reigns, a simple misunderstanding, a perceived transgression, can escalate into a life-or-death struggle in the blink of an eye. The mountains remain beautiful, but they also hold secrets, and some secrets are best left undisturbed.